It doesn't happen in a single moment. It sneaks up slowly, like fog swallowing a streetlight, until you're left staring at the ceiling in a quiet room that once felt warm. You begin to understand, not with panic, but with an eerie calmness, that there's no cavalry, no miracle, no grand rescue, just you and the weight you carry. This realization doesn't scream. It whispers, and once you hear it, something inside you stops reaching. You think about the times you waited for a call, a knock, a gesture, even a glance that meant someone saw your suffering and chose to step in. Maybe they meant to. Maybe they tried. But they didn't arrive. They didn't stay. The door never opened, and the silence stretched too long. Eventually, your body stopped expecting it. You sat back down in the chair you always sit in, pulled the blanket tighter, and learned to breathe in isolation. Not because you wanted to, but because hope started to feel heavier than the emptiness. You tell yourself you're strong. That self-reliance is noble. But deep down, you remember how good it felt, just once, to be picked up off the floor by someone who didn't have to. And now, you can't even imagine what that feels like anymore. Because that part of you, the part that believed help was on its way, is fading. Not dead, just fading. That's the first trigger. The slow internal death of expectation. It's not dramatic. It's not tragic. It's clinical. It's the emotional equivalent of watching paint dry on the wall of a locked room. You start to detach. Not because you're brave, but because clinging to hope began to rot you from the inside. Your brain starts to file every disappointment under the same folder. What did you expect? And soon, even when someone does try to reach you, you flinch. Not out of fear, but disbelief. You've rehearsed your loneliness so often that companionship feels like a ghost story. You smile. You nod. But inside, you're already building exits. Because you've trained yourself for survival, not rescue. The worst part, you begin to prefer it. You begin to crave the silence over the noise of false promises. You'd rather suffer alone than gamble on the idea that someone might care enough to carry your weight for even a moment. This is how numbness begins. Not with trauma, not with betrayal, but with the quiet, repeated absence of rescue. It's not about drama. It's about erosion. And tonight, lying in your bed, with no one coming, you realize you don't even wish they would anymore. Trigger 2. When you realize your absence doesn't disrupt anything. It starts with a simple thought you don't want to admit to yourself, that if you vanished tomorrow, nothing around you would stop. The routines would continue. The schedules would remain untouched. People might notice, might pause for a moment, but then they'd move on with remarkable ease, not out of cruelty, but because your presence, in the grand pattern of their lives, was never something they had to truly depend on. You begin to test this thought in quiet ways. You withdraw slightly, delay your responses, stop showing up to optional things, and observe what happens. You expect concern, maybe curiosity, even irritation, but nothing happens. Conversations continue without you. Decisions are made. Messages move in threads that no longer include your name. You were there, and now you're not, and the world didn't blink. You sit with that realization for longer than you'd like to. Not because it breaks you, there's no drama to it, but because it alters something more fundamental. It reshapes how you see your value. You've spent so long trying to contribute, to be useful, to show up and matter. But the lack of reaction, the seamlessness of your absence, suggests something else entirely. You were never essential. You were, at best, an accessory, an optional voice in the background, appreciated when present, but effortlessly substituted when gone. The shift is subtle but irreversible. You stop putting effort into connections. You stop offering insights in conversations. You perform your responsibilities, meet your deadlines, but the emotional investment fades. If being present or absent changes nothing, then why attach meaning to either state? You begin to inhabit a kind of psychological limbo, not depressed, not angry, just detached. You no longer measure your value by how people react to you, because there's no reaction left to measure. You observe your own life the way someone might watch an abandoned building, intact on the outside, hollow within. It doesn't make you bitter. It makes you quiet. Your conversations become shorter, not out of rudeness, but because the effort of shaping yourself into someone visible starts to feel pointless. You keep showing up where you must, but the version of you that hoped to be felt, to leave some kind of impression, stops making the trip. You start existing more in your head than in your relationships. You replay interactions, not for meaning, but to catalog how often your presence went unnoticed. Eventually, you stop keeping track altogether. And then it hits you. This is what emotional invisibility feels like. Not being ignored, but being effortlessly excluded by people who genuinely don't realize they've left you out. And once that becomes familiar, you adapt to it. You expect nothing, which means you're no longer disappointed. And in that numbness, there's a kind of efficiency. You stop checking your phone. You stop waiting for someone to miss you. You disappear a little more each day. And the world, just as you suspected, doesn't stop for a second. Trigger 3. When you stop expecting your emotions to be understood. There's a certain kind of silence that settles in when you realize that trying to explain how you feel won't lead to understanding. You could lay it all out, every tangled thread of thought, every suppressed fear, every irrational fragment that keeps you awake at night, and the person listening would nod politely, maybe say something comforting, and then go back to their own version of normal. Not because they're unkind, but because your experience simply doesn't register for them the way it does for you. What you're saying is real to you, but it doesn't land. At first, you keep trying. You rephrase. You simplify. You wait for the right moment. You drop hints, hoping someone will pick them up and ask the right question. But no one ever does. They either miss it completely or offer responses that feel mechanical. That must be tough. I hear you. It'll pass. You begin to understand that they're listening out of habit, not because they're meeting you where you are. Eventually, you give up. You stop sharing. You stop expecting anyone to decode what you're feeling. It's not worth the energy. You play along with surface-level conversations and suppress the impulse to bring anything deeper into them. You tell yourself you're just being realistic, that not everything needs to be said, that you're protecting yourself from disappointment. But beneath that logic, something else is happening. Your emotions are withdrawing, not disappearing, just going underground. You start processing everything internally, not because it's the best option, but because it's the only one left. And after enough time, you stop feeling the urge to speak at all. You don't vent. You don't confess. You don't reach out. You carry it alone, and it becomes second nature. When someone asks how you're doing, you answer automatically. I'm fine. All good. Just tired. They accept it. They move on. And you wonder if they ever really expected you to answer honestly in the first place. This is the trigger, not the isolation itself, but the internal shift that tells you your inner world no longer belongs in the outside one. You don't even feel betrayed. You just stop believing your feelings are something anyone else is meant to carry. You stop holding out for that connection, that flicker of real comprehension, and instead, you retreat into a kind of emotional minimalism. Say less. Reveal nothing. Protect everything. What follows isn't anger or sadness, it's numbness. Your emotions become quieter, not because they've healed, but because they've learned to stay hidden. You function well. You manage your responsibilities. You appear stable. But you know that under the surface, there's a thick layer of dust settling over everything you once tried to make visible. You don't expect to be understood anymore. You just hope no one asks. Trigger 4. When you begin to feel disconnected from the person you're pretending to be, you start to notice it during small interactions. You hear yourself speak, watch yourself smile, go through the rhythms of normal conversation, and something about it feels artificial. Not because you're lying, but because the version of you being presented doesn't quite match the one that exists in your head. You respond to jokes, offer polite opinions, nod at stories. You're engaged, but it all feels like a script, a version of yourself you've built to keep things smooth and acceptable, even when that version feels nothing like the real you anymore. At first, you think you're just tired. Maybe it's the stress, the routines, the emotional drain of pretending you're fine when you're not. But then it becomes a pattern. You wake up and step into a role that runs on autopilot. You function well. You handle tasks, reply to messages, keep your tone warm. But the actual you, the one with unfiltered thoughts and unspoken doubts, feels buried somewhere deeper, watching from a distance. This gap between who you are and who you perform starts to widen. And the wider it gets, the more detached you feel. You begin to sense that you're living as someone else's expectation of you, a safer, more manageable version of yourself, not out of deceit, but survival. You're playing the character that everyone seems to like, the person who gets along, who smiles through discomfort, who doesn't ask for more than what's offered. The disconnection doesn't create panic. It creates a kind of dull ache, like watching your reflection do things you no longer relate to. You start feeling like a placeholder in your own life, present in every scene but absent from every intention. People say you're doing great. You nod and say thank you. But the words don't land anywhere meaningful, because the praise is for someone you're not even sure you recognize anymore. Eventually, the line between your real feelings and your projected self becomes blurred. You laugh when expected. You sympathize when required. You tell people what they want to hear. And as time passes, you stop checking in with how you actually feel. You just perform, not for attention, not for manipulation, but because it's easier than explaining what's missing. The more you perform, the harder it becomes to stop. People grow accustomed to the version of you that doesn't need help, doesn't break down, doesn't complicate things. And you start to believe that revealing your real self would be a disruption, that showing up as the raw, unfiltered you would cost more than it's worth. So you bury it, deep, quiet, rehearsed. This is the trigger. The moment you realize you've become a stranger to yourself, not through some single loss or trauma, but through thousands of small compromises made to keep things smooth. And now, standing in the middle of your own life, you're performing a role you never meant to audition for, but you're already in costume, and the crowd has already clapped. Trigger 5, when you start feeling safer being unseen. There was a time when being noticed felt good, when being heard, acknowledged, or remembered felt like a kind of proof that you mattered. Now, the thought of being seen doesn't comfort you. It unsettles you. It feels like exposure, like being under a light that only reminds you of how much you no longer want to explain. You've spent so long performing versions of yourself that being observed now feels more like a risk than a reward. So, without fully deciding to, you begin to disappear. You don't hide in the dramatic sense. You still show up to work. You still send messages. You still make eye contact when required. But you gradually stop standing out. You fade by subtraction, one small social withdrawal at a time. You become the person who listens more than they speak, who skips group calls, who stays in the background of every interaction. And at first, people notice. They ask if something's wrong. You say no. You tell them you're just tired. And after a while, they stop asking. You've trained them to accept your silence. The invisibility grows comfortable. You feel less pressure, less expectation. No one asks for your opinion. No one seeks your advice. No one includes you in decisions. And instead of fighting against that, you begin to prefer it. You become familiar with the quiet that follows being forgotten. There's a kind of peace in knowing no one is waiting on you. No one is depending on you. No one is watching to see how you'll react. It's not that you've stopped caring about people. It's that you've stopped believing that your presence has weight. You feel replaceable. And in a way, that makes things easier. When you don't expect your voice to change anything, you stop stressing over whether to speak. When you don't believe your input is needed, you stop wrestling with how to contribute. You shrink your presence down to something manageable, something no one questions or probes. And in doing so, you avoid discomfort. You avoid vulnerability. You avoid everything. Eventually, the world stops requesting your involvement. You are left to your own space, your own pace, your own contained life. Some would call it isolation, but you wouldn't. To you, it feels like protection. Being unseen means being untouched. It means no one can misinterpret you, misjudge you, or mishandle you. It means never having to explain what you're not even sure how to articulate. This is the trigger. The moment you realize you're more at ease being invisible than being recognized. And not just to strangers, but to everyone. You don't want to be asked what's wrong. You don't want to be pulled out of your shell. Because the shell has become your house. Not a temporary refuge, but a permanent address. And once you realize you feel safer inside it than outside of it, you stop wondering how to leave. Because you don't want to be found. Trigger 6. When you start dismissing your own needs before anyone else can, you tell yourself it's not a big deal. You tell yourself you'll handle it. You tell yourself other people have it worse, that your feelings are excessive, that your needs can wait. The words come easily now. You've rehearsed them so many times they barely feel like lies. But deep down, there's something else happening. You're not just postponing your needs. You're deleting them before they form. You've learned, consciously or not, that expressing what you want opens a door to disappointment. So instead of waiting for someone to shut you down, you do it yourself. You silence your hunger for support. You shrink your emotional reactions. You prepare yourself to live without comfort, without help, without acknowledgement. Not because you don't need these things, but because not needing them feels safer. You begin to talk yourself out of everything. A simple request feels like a burden. Asking for understanding feels like too much. Needing reassurance feels childish. So you fold in on yourself. You learn to cope quietly, to bend until the pain becomes manageable, and then pretend it was never there at all. The people around you don't notice the shift. Why would they? You've made it easy. You smile. You say yes. You take care of what's needed. You even offer help to others. You've become the kind of person others rely on, not realizing that you've built that role by refusing to rely on anyone yourself. The numbness doesn't come in like a wave. It arrives in layers. Every time you choose silence instead of asking for clarity. Every time you say it's fine when it's not. Every time you let someone assume you're okay because correcting them feels exhausting. Your inner voice grows weaker. Your emotional needs become distant, like background noise you've learned to tune out. Eventually, you stop checking in with yourself altogether. You don't ask what you feel, what you need, what you want. You operate on autopilot. Do what's expected. Stay quiet. Don't complicate things. And when someone asks what you need, you hesitate, not because you don't want to say it, but because you no longer know. Trigger 7. When you stop feeling guilty for not caring anymore. At first, the detachment disturbed you. The way you didn't flinch when someone cried. The way you didn't respond to messages. The way you forgot to check in. Didn't feel anything when you were left out. Didn't react when you saw someone struggle. You used to be the person who cared too much. Now you feel like someone else entirely, unmoved, disinterested, numb. What scares you more is how natural it's begun to feel. The absence of emotional weight isn't alarming anymore. It's convenient, clean, efficient. There are no ups and downs, no guilt, no emotional labor. You show up where required. You say the right things. But inside, you're flat. You used to feel a surge of guilt when you didn't care. Now, you rationalize it. Everyone's overwhelmed. You're protecting your energy. You're just setting boundaries. Maybe that's partially true, but there's something colder underneath. You're not just protecting your peace. You're letting your empathy rot. Quietly. Willingly. The people around you don't notice. You've kept the outer shell intact. You smile when appropriate. You ask the polite questions. But everything you do is mechanical. No depth. No investment. You can't remember the last time you felt real concern. And if someone called you out, you wouldn't even deny it. You've stopped expecting anything from anyone, and in return, you've stopped offering anything of yourself. It feels fair, balanced, empty. Eventually, you realize you don't even miss the part of you that used to care. Trigger 8. When you begin to question if your presence makes people tired. It's a thought you never used to entertain. You assumed you were a good presence, helpful, kind, maybe even comforting. But now, you've started paying closer attention. The shift in tone when you speak. The way responses come slower. The way people seem relieved when the conversation ends. Or how they subtly redirect when you try to say something personal. It doesn't happen all the time, but enough that it starts to form a pattern. And once you start noticing it, it becomes hard to unsee. You begin to wonder if your presence is something people tolerate, not welcome. If your voice is background noise. If your thoughts are met with hidden exhaustion. Maybe you talk too much. Maybe you talk too little. Maybe you don't know how to bring the right kind of energy into a space anymore. Maybe you never did. At first, you try to adjust. You cut yourself short. You offer lighter answers. You ask more questions instead of sharing. You smile more, even when it feels forced. But the tension doesn't go away. If anything, it increases. You start overthinking every sentence, every silence, every glance. You don't want to be dramatic. You don't want to be paranoid. But the feeling builds. Maybe people are just being polite. Maybe they've outgrown you. Or maybe they never actually liked being around you in the first place. This realization doesn't come with an explosion. It arrives quietly, wrapped in small observations. You see people light up when someone else joins the conversation, but not when you do. You hear them sigh a little when you leave, thinking you didn't catch it. You feel how they drift away, emotionally, even while sitting next to you. And the more it happens, the more you retreat. You start minimizing yourself, not to manipulate anyone, but to reduce the weight you believe you carry. You answer in shorter sentences. You leave messages on read instead of replying. You excuse yourself early. You give people an out before they even ask for one. And over time, they stop noticing your absence, which only confirms your suspicion you were draining them. You never meant to be. But that doesn't change the possibility that you are. Eventually, you learn how to take up less space. Not physically, but emotionally. You stop sharing hard days. You stop asking for help. You stop hoping to be the kind of person someone looks forward to being around. Instead, you learn how to fade gracefully, to smile just enough, to nod in the right moments, to excuse yourself before the silence gets awkward. This is the trigger. The moment you stop assuming your presence is a gift and begin to fear it's a burden. You don't ask anymore, because you don't want the confirmation. You just withdraw, quietly, respectfully, completely. Because if your presence drains people, your absence is the kindest thing you can offer. Trigger 9. When you stop trusting people with good intentions. At first, it feels like protection. You tell yourself you're being cautious, that you've simply learned how to be more discerning. But over time, it morphs into something colder. You stop believing kindness is sincere. You start scanning people's words for hidden motives. Compliments feel like setups. Support feels like manipulation waiting to unfold. Even when someone offers help with no strings attached, you hesitate because somewhere along the line, you learned that even good intentions come with consequences. You weren't always like this. There was a time when kindness softened you, when someone's warmth made you feel seen. But enough disappointments, enough backhanded favors, enough misread cues, eventually they train you to doubt everything. You learn that some people only show up when it's convenient, that others expect something in return, that even those who claim to care can leave without explanation. So now, when someone reaches out, your first instinct is to retreat. You keep the conversation surface level. You downplay your needs. You assume they'll lose interest eventually, or worse, that their interest was never real to begin with. You tell yourself you're avoiding drama, avoiding dependency, But what you're really avoiding is vulnerability. This becomes the new filter through which you view the world. Every smile, every gesture, every soft tone, it all feels rehearsed. A prelude to something disappointing. You nod. You say thank you, but your guard never drops. Not really. You interact politely, but you remain closed. Not because you want to be distant, because distance feels safer than betrayal. Eventually, you don't even notice how much you're keeping to yourself. You respond on autopilot. You deflect affection. You avoid emotional closeness. Not because you don't crave connection, but because you've stopped believing it can survive reality. And so, when someone truly does mean well, you're already too far gone to receive it. Trigger 10. When you realize you're easier to be around when you're not yourself. It starts with small adjustments. You tone yourself down in certain rooms. You avoid difficult topics. You mimic the energy around you, trying to keep things smooth. And people respond well to that version of you. They laugh more. They invite you out. They say you're fun, or chill, or easygoing. And so, you keep presenting that version because it gets results. But after a while, it doesn't feel like a version anymore. It feels like the whole performance. You know how to avoid friction, how to be agreeable, how to stay neutral. The problem is, in doing that, you've flattened yourself into something palatable, acceptable, harmless. You stop mentioning the things that actually matter to you. You stop pushing back when something doesn't sit right. You keep your struggles vague, your opinions soft, your presence light. You become the kind of person who's easy to like, but hard to know. Because the real you, the frustrated you, the opinionated you, the emotional you, is locked in a back room, waiting for a moment that never comes. People say they love having you around, but they don't really know who they're around. They're connecting with a filtered version of you, one that's curated for comfort, not connection. And the worst part, you start believing that version is the only one worth showing. Over time, the idea of being fully yourself starts to feel selfish. Why risk conflict? Why test anyone's patience? Why say something real when something vague will do? So you nod. You agree. You adapt. Until eventually, there's no room left for the parts of you that feel too heavy to carry into the room. This is how you go numb, not by force, but by performance. And the more you play the role, the more the role becomes you. Trigger 11. When you feel more relieved by goodbyes than hurt. You used to fear endings. The silence after a fight. The last message that never got a reply. The door that closed without warning. Goodbyes came with grief, confusion, longing. But lately, something's changed. When someone leaves, whether a friend drifts away or a relationship fizzles out, you don't ache anymore. You exhale. It's not that you're glad they're gone. It's that maintaining connections has started to feel like effort without reward. Like keeping plates spinning that you were never allowed to stop watching. Every interaction comes with subtext. Every exchange carries weight. And when someone exits, the pressure lifts. No more decoding. No more guessing. No more giving more than you get. The shift isn't immediate. It creeps in after too many one-sided efforts. Too many apologies you didn't know. Too many times you let things go just to keep the peace. You begin to associate relationships with exhaustion. You start measuring people by how much they drain you, not how much they bring you joy. So when a goodbye comes, you don't chase. You don't beg. You don't even ask why. You just feel the tension dissolve and let it go. You tell yourself it's growth. Maybe it is. Or maybe you're just tired. Eventually, you stop fearing the next goodbye. You begin to see it as a form of clarity. Another reminder that you're easier to be around when you're alone. Trigger 12. When you start feeling like you're just fulfilling obligations, not living a life. You get up, get dressed, go where you're supposed to go, do what's expected of you, and then return home, day after day. There's no dread, but also no anticipation. No major crises, but no real joy either. You're not in a bad place. You're just in a place where everything feels scheduled, hollow, and slightly too quiet. You're functioning perfectly, visibly, but there's no sense of life inside the routine. Just checklists, just maintenance. You begin to notice how your days don't really ask who you are. They just ask what you're doing. If you're on time, if you replied to the message, if you met the quota, if you were polite, if you showed up. You answer all those questions effortlessly, but no one asks what you felt, or if anything mattered. Eventually, you stop asking that too. Everything you do becomes a transaction. Smile here, deliver there, pretend interest when appropriate. Keep moving. You know how to do it all. You even do it well. But it doesn't feel like living. It feels like managing a role you didn't choose, but don't dare walk away from. Because walking away would mean confrontation, questions, disruption. You find yourself filling time with activities just to fill time. Shows you don't care about. Conversations that mean nothing. Meetings that lead nowhere. You keep yourself busy so you don't have to sit with the fact that your life has become an obligation, not an experience. And slowly, your sense of identity starts fading into the background noise of your responsibilities. This is how emotional detachment sneaks in, not with a dramatic loss, but with the slow erosion of meaning. You don't even miss the feeling of aliveness anymore. You just forget what it was like to have it. Trigger 13. When you feel more at home in silence than in conversation. There was a time when voices filled the room and gave it shape, when conversation was connection, and words were bridges. But now, you crave the quiet. Not just because it soothes you, but because it protects you from the effort of having to participate. Conversation doesn't feel like intimacy anymore. It feels like a test you're too tired to study for. You find yourself pulling away from casual talk, even with people you like. The idea of exchanging updates, laughing on cue, asking about someone's day, it all feels heavier than it should. Not because you dislike people, but because something in you has run out of the energy it takes to be present in dialogue. You begin to notice how much talking requires you to assemble a version of yourself that people can engage with. One that's responsive, appropriate, light, and increasingly, you just don't have the motivation to perform that role. You sit in group settings and contribute when needed, but mostly you listen, not because you're interested, but because you're absent. You find more comfort in the quiet, in sitting alone, in walking without a podcast playing, in hearing nothing but ambient noise. It's not peace, exactly. It's more like stillness, a blank space that doesn't require anything from you. And compared to the pressure of conversation, that blankness feels kind. People start noticing you're quieter. They joke about it, ask if you're okay. You smile and say you're just tired. Which isn't a lie, but also isn't the full truth. The truth is, words used to make you feel alive. Now they just remind you of how far you've drifted from your own emotional center. Eventually, even when someone tries to connect, you hesitate. You don't want to explain why you've gone quiet. You don't want to unpack what you're not even sure how to name. So you say less, and the silence becomes your home. Trigger 14. When you begin to feel like your emotions are inconvenient for other people, you learn to read the room before you speak. You scan people's faces before sharing anything real. You soften your tone, shrink your sentences. You practice pre-editing your feelings so they land gently, if at all, because somewhere along the way, you started noticing that your emotions don't fit comfortably into other people's lives. It might have been subtle at first. A flinch when you opened up. A long pause after you admitted you weren't okay. A change in tone when you shared something too heavy. You could feel it in the way conversations shifted, how people responded with unease or silence, or quickly steered the topic back to something easier. And so you adapted. You stopped showing the full weight of your reactions. You laughed at things that weren't funny just to stay aligned. You said, "It's all good," when it wasn't, because discomfort felt like a sin. You began to believe that your sadness was a burden, your confusion a disruption, your truth something best diluted before release. Now, even when you do feel something, your first instinct is to contain it. Not because you're trying to be strong, but because you've learned that your feelings come with consequences. They create awkwardness. They create work for others. And so, you manage them internally. You rehearse how to sound light when you feel heavy. You minimize. This is the trigger, not emotional pain itself, but the internal shift that tells you your emotions are better hidden than shared. You stop reaching out. You stop expressing. And after a while, even you start to believe that your feelings are too much for anyone to hold. So you hold them alone. Trigger 15. When you begin to prefer being misunderstood over being known. At some point, you realize it's easier to let people misread you than to correct them. They assume you're cold, distant, too quiet. Some think you're confident. Others think you're fragile. You don't correct any of it. In fact, you begin to prefer it that way. Their versions of you are simpler, easier to manage, less work than explaining the real thing. You used to want to be known. You wanted someone to understand the nuance behind your silence, to recognize when you were struggling even when you didn't say anything out loud. But that desire faded, not because it wasn't real, but because you got tired of the constant friction it brought. The explaining, the clarifying, the vulnerability that never landed where you hoped it would. So now, when someone makes an assumption about who you are, you nod. You let it slide. You become what they project. Not because it's who you are, but because it's the path of least resistance. You start to watch yourself operate through the lens of what others expect. You give them fragments they can process, instead of the full picture that overwhelms. Being misunderstood starts to feel like armor. It keeps people at a distance. It spares you the disappointment of being truly seen and still not accepted. If they think you're aloof, fine. If they think you're overly chill, let them. You don't feel the urge to clarify anymore. Because deep down, you don't believe clarity will bring you connection. You believe it will only make the rejection more personal. Over time, you forget what it's like to be transparent. You withhold by default. You start each interaction already editing yourself. You don't give people a chance to meet the real you, because the idea of being known now feels threatening, not healing. And in that distance, the numbness grows. You no longer crave connection. You just want to be left alone in peace, even if it means no one ever really gets you again. Trigger 16. When you start measuring relationships by how little they cost you emotionally. There was a time when connection was about depth, who made you feel seen, who helped you grow, who understood the layers of your thoughts. But that's changed. Now, connection is measured differently. It's not about how much someone means to you. It's about how little effort it takes to maintain them. You start preferring relationships that don't ask for much. The kind where you can disappear for a while and return without having to explain. The kind where you don't have to talk about anything real. The kind where silence isn't questioned, where energy isn't expected, where you can show up at 50% and no one notices. At first, it feels like relief. These relationships don't drain you. They let you coast. But then something deeper begins to rot underneath. You stop forming new bonds. You avoid intensity. You start to see emotional closeness as a liability, not a comfort. You tell yourself you're just setting boundaries. But what you're really doing is shrinking from the possibility of being known too deeply. You surround yourself with people who are safe because they don't reach in too far. You seek out surface-level company, not because you're shallow, but because you're tired, exhausted from the demands of real connection. You start calculating how much energy someone will cost you before deciding if they're worth talking to. Eventually, emotional effort becomes a threat. You avoid people who require anything more than casual conversation. You feel irritated by depth. You become suspicious of intimacy. You don't call it fear. You call it self-care. But somewhere in the quiet, you know the truth. You're not protecting your peace. You're isolating your core. And the longer you do it, the more that becomes your default setting. Trigger 17. When you begin to forget what excitement feels like. It hits you when you try to recall the last time you genuinely looked forward to something, not something you were obligated to do. Not something that checked a box, but something that made your chest feel lighter just thinking about it. You come up empty. You try to pretend that's normal, but it lingers. You go through your days like a machine. Tasks get done. Meals are made. The calendar moves forward, but nothing lights up anymore. Events that should excite you feel muted. Even the things you used to love, music, messages, familiar places, they've dulled. You nod, smile, show up, but inside, you're flat. You tell yourself maybe it's just burnout, that rest will fix it. But rest comes, and the emptiness stays. You try new things. They fade quickly. You chase old hobbies. They no longer fit. It's not depression. Not quite. You're not hopeless. You just don't care. You've stopped expecting life to surprise you in ways that matter. Your brain begins to register all anticipation as noise. You don't fantasize about vacations. You don't feel butterflies before meetings. You no longer imagine something unexpected happening for the better. You live in a flat line. Not painful, but not alive either. This is when apathy locks in. Not because you want it, but because you've grown accustomed to the absence of spark. You don't miss excitement. You just notice it's gone. And after enough time, even noticing that becomes exhausting. Trigger 18. When you stop feeling the urge to explain yourself. There was a time when misunderstanding pushed you into overdrive. You'd explain, clarify, offer context. You wanted to be accurately seen. If someone misinterpreted your silence, your motives, your absence, you made sure to fix it. Because being misread felt like erasure. It felt wrong. But lately, you've stopped caring. You hear someone frame your behavior in a way that doesn't match your truth, and you let them. You see someone pull away without knowing the real reason, and you don't reach out to correct their version. You hear whispers of who people think you are, and you no longer feel compelled to provide the full story. Not because you're above it, but because the energy it takes to correct perception feels pointless now. It's not apathy toward the truth. It's the slow death of effort. You've come to understand that most people don't want the full picture. They want the version that fits easily into their narrative. And trying to expand their view? It's a battle that leaves you depleted. So you stay quiet. You let them decide who you are. And move on. You begin to live with the silence that comes from holding back. Not as a punishment, but as a choice. You tell yourself it's privacy. You tell yourself it's maturity. But really, it's resignation. If your reality can be twisted, misread, or ignored, then why keep offering it? Eventually, your emotional reflex fades. Someone misunderstands you, and you shrug. Someone assumes the worst, and you don't argue. Someone lets go, believing a version of you that never existed, and you don't defend it. You used to care about being known. Now you just want to be left alone. Trigger 19. When you feel more numb after achieving something than proud. You accomplish something. Something that once might have made you feel alive. A promotion. A project. A long-term goal. People around you cheer. They say they're proud. They tell you to celebrate. But you're just there. You nod. You say thank you. You smile when prompted. Inside, there's nothing. No joy. No sense of arrival. Just another box checked. Another quiet moment of disconnection. It didn't used to be this way. You remember the rush of progress. The way even small wins used to light something in you. But now, each step forward feels muted. You tell yourself you should feel something. You try to squeeze out gratitude. But all you feel is the weight of expectation. The sense that this should be enough. That you should be fulfilled. That this is what you've worked for. You stare at the outcome and wonder why it doesn't feel like anything. Not even relief. It's not dissatisfaction. It's not disappointment. It's just silence. A blank emotional screen where pride should be. You realize that the process hollowed you out. The pressure, the self-denial, the constant pushing, it drained everything out of the goal before you could arrive. And now that you're here, there's no you left to enjoy it. You did everything right. You earned it. But your emotions didn't make the journey. This is the trigger, not failure. but success that doesn't land. You keep succeeding, but you stop caring. And eventually, you stop trying to celebrate, because the joy never comes, just the applause of others, echoing off the walls of a room you no longer live in. Trigger 20. When you realize you're easier to replace than you thought. You thought you had a place, not just physically, but emotionally, in your job, in your circle, in someone's life. You thought your absence would cause a shift, something visible, something real. But then you're gone for a while. You take a step back. You let someone else take the call, do the work, fill the space, and everything goes on as if you were never part of it. No stumble, no pause, just seamless continuity. At first, you tell yourself it's a good thing. Systems should function. People should be okay. But the ease with which you're replaced unsettles you. The way no one hesitates. The way no one says, "We needed you." The way they thank the next person without hesitation. You start looking back at everything you gave: time, effort, loyalty, presence, and you wonder if any of it actually mattered. Not in a bitter way, in a quiet, detached way, because you weren't asking to be irreplaceable, but you weren't expecting to be invisible either. You become cautious. You invest less. You show up with less of yourself. You tell yourself you're just being wise. But deep down, it's the early stages of emotional withdrawal. You don't want to care as much about places or people that move on too easily. Eventually, you stop expecting permanence. You stop believing in roots. And you stop trying to be unforgettable. Because now you know you never were. Trigger 21. When you stop expecting apologies and start writing people off in silence. There was a time when unresolved tension would gnaw at you. You'd wait for someone to reach out. You'd replay the conversation, the tone, the silence that followed. You'd analyze every word, wondering what you could have done differently, whether they realized they hurt you, whether they cared enough to fix it. And each time you didn't get an apology, you felt yourself tighten, still hoping, still watching the door. But over time, the waiting wore you down. Now, when someone crosses a line, ignores you, disrespects you, forgets you, you no longer brace for the apology. You no longer prepare your response. You simply detach, quietly, internally, without discussion. You adjust your expectations in real time and let the emotional connection die without ceremony. You don't tell them what they did. You don't demand acknowledgement. You just accept that they won't come back in the way you need them to. This isn't forgiveness. It isn't healing. It's emotional damage control. You no longer need the apology because you've trained yourself to not expect people to take responsibility. You don't chase closure. You don't open the door again just to explain why you closed it in the first place. You just carry the weight and keep moving. Over time, this becomes your reflex. You feel the shift, someone breaks trust. And instead of confrontation, you go silent. You let them keep their version of the story. You stop correcting the record. You let them think you're cold, or overreacting, or distant. It's easier to lose people quietly than to beg them to see the pain they caused. This is the trigger, not being hurt, but realizing the people who hurt you don't even notice. And once you see that clearly, you never wait for an apology again. Trigger 22. When you no longer trust yourself to get excited about new people. You meet someone. Maybe they seem kind. Maybe they understand your humor. Maybe they ask the right questions. Or give off that rare feeling that they actually see you. You feel the familiar pull possibility. Connection. Maybe this time, it'll be different. But that feeling doesn't get very far. Because something in you pushes back almost immediately. You remember how this usually ends. How enthusiasm makes you open up too fast. How honesty gives someone too much leverage. How vulnerability starts as a bridge and ends as a weapon. You remember being excited about someone who vanished. You remember feeling understood before you were misunderstood. And so, you stop yourself early. You keep things light. You dodge sincerity. You talk without saying anything real. You pretend it's about boundaries. But the truth is, You don't trust your own judgment anymore. You've gotten it wrong too many times. You've read the signs incorrectly. You've let your guard down for people who didn't earn it. And now, excitement feels like a red flag. Not for them, for you. The worst part is knowing you used to love that feeling. The rush of a new connection. The comfort of being seen. Now you associate it with risk. With regret. You don't feel hopeful. You feel cornered. You wonder how long it will take before they leave. Before they get bored. Before they change. And so you sabotage it early. Telling yourself you're protecting your peace. Eventually, you stop letting yourself get excited at all. Not because people aren't good, but because you no longer trust your ability to recognize when they are. Trigger 23. When you begin to avoid people who still see the old version of you. There are people who knew you before the shutdown, before the detachment, before your face stopped reacting with every emotion you felt. They remember the version of you that used to laugh easily, speak openly, and care too much. And now, when they talk to you, you feel it. The way their expectations still reach for someone who doesn't exist anymore. They ask questions like you still light up inside. They make references to things you no longer feel connected to. They treat you like you're still that soft version of yourself, the one who hadn't yet learned to harden, to shrink, to observe instead of participate. And as much as you want to reconnect, there's a part of you that flinches at being reminded of who you used to be. You start avoiding them, not because they're harmful, but because being around them feels like pretending. You nod, you smile, you fake enthusiasm. But internally, there's a disconnect. Their memory of you holds too much light. It clashes with the dullness you now live in. And instead of trying to bridge the gap, you take the easier route, silence. You don't explain the shift. You don't tell them you've changed. You just let the connection die slowly, quietly, without confrontation. You stop replying as quickly. You turn down invitations. You fade from their world, not out of resentment, but out of discomfort. They're looking for someone you can no longer be. This is the trigger. When being around those who once loved the old, it makes you feel more like a ghost than a person. And it's easier to disappear than to keep pretending. Trigger 24. When you start withdrawing from people before they have the chance to leave, you notice it's happening again. You feel the shift before it becomes visible. Maybe they're busy. Maybe their responses are slower. Maybe they cancel plans, or forget to follow up, or seem less present when you talk. Nothing obvious, nothing direct, but your brain catches it before you can stop yourself. The threat of being left creeps in, and you don't wait for confirmation. You begin to pull away first. You convince yourself you're just giving space. You reduce your presence in conversations. You share less. You respond with delays. You tell yourself it's preventative care. But the truth is simpler. You're preparing for the moment they disappear, so it won't hurt as much when they do. You've seen this before. People slowly lose interest. They start off warm, attentive, full of energy. Then something shifts, and they move on without explanation, without warning. And every time it happens, something in you hardens. So this time, instead of clinging, you detach early. You go softly, not to hurt them, to protect yourself. This pattern becomes familiar. You don't let anyone get close enough to leave, because you've already marked the exit in your head. You catch red flags where there may be none. You interpret silence as disinterest. You see any dip in attention as the beginning of abandonment. And rather than risk the fall, you step out first. People around you start to notice. They say you disappear suddenly. They say you're hard to read. They say they thought things were fine. And you never know how to explain it, that it's easier to vanish than to be left standing in confusion again. Eventually, you stop letting connections deepen, not because they're not meaningful, but because the end always feels inevitable. And you'd rather be the one who disappears first. Trigger 25. When you start saying, "I'm just tired," instead of admitting you feel nothing. You hear yourself say it again. "I'm just tired." It's the answer that ends the conversation. The phrase that explains everything without inviting more questions. It covers the blank expression, the short replies, the missed calls, the way your energy feels flat even after hours of rest. It's a believable excuse. And it works, because no one pushes back when someone says they're tired. But deep down, you know it's not physical fatigue. You sleep, you rest, you take breaks, and still, the heaviness stays. The fog, the inability to care, the absence of enthusiasm. You're not tired from doing too much. You're tired because nothing feels real. Nothing feels worth starting. Nothing feels like it matters. You use the word tired because it's easier than saying you're detached, that you're going through your day like a shadow, that even things that used to move you now feel distant, like they're happening in another room. You say you're tired because saying, "I feel nothing," sounds dramatic. And you've already trained yourself not to be a burden. Over time, tired becomes your cover. You use it in every context. You don't show up to something, just tired. You don't text back, sorry, tired. You don't react to news that once would have shaken you. Yeah, just a bit tired lately. People accept it. They nod. They let it go. And that's what you want. Because the alternative is explaining something you barely understand yourself. And if you said the truth out loud, that you're not tired, you're emotionally blank, you're not sure anyone would know what to do with that. Trigger 26. When you start preferring predictable loneliness over unreliable companionship. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from inconsistency. The kind where someone says they care, but only shows up when convenient. The kind where plans get canceled last minute. Where texts are warm one day and cold the next. Where you're close, then distant, then close again. You begin to realize that this kind of company doesn't soothe your loneliness. It intensifies it. You start to dread the highs more than the lows, because the highs come with hope, with connection, with that brief feeling that you matter. But the crash always follows. The silence, the excuse, the unreturned message. And every time it happens, it carves into you a little deeper. Eventually, the unpredictability becomes unbearable. You find yourself bracing for the letdown before it even arrives. You stop getting excited when someone reaches out. You stop believing their apologies. You stop trying to adjust your schedule to theirs. Because the effort always outweighs the return. So you retreat. Not dramatically, just enough to regain control. You stop chasing. You stop expecting. You start choosing solitude. Not because you enjoy being alone all the time, but because it's consistent. You can rely on it. It doesn't swing between affection and absence. It doesn't confuse you. It doesn't hurt you. You begin to prefer the quiet, the stability of your own company. It's not ideal, but it's manageable. It's a choice you understand. And in that choice, there's power. Not because it makes you stronger, but because it finally stops the cycle of emotional whiplash. And in a world where connection has become synonymous with unpredictability, reliable loneliness becomes a kind of peace. Trigger 27. When you stop sharing good news because no one really celebrates with you. There was a time when something good happened, and your first instinct was to tell someone. A new opportunity, a personal milestone, something small but meaningful. You'd grab your phone, send the message, look forward to the reply. You expected a smile, a kind word, maybe a moment where it felt like someone else felt the happiness with you. But slowly, over time, those reactions stopped arriving. You'd share something, and the reply would come late, or short, or distracted. Sometimes it would come wrapped in comparison, or skepticism, or even envy disguised as a joke. Must be nice. Wish I had your luck. We'll see how long that lasts. And you'd feel it, not just the lack of excitement, but the weight of having to downplay your own joy so it didn't feel like a burden on someone else. So you adjusted. You shared less. You kept the good news to yourself. Not because you didn't want to celebrate, but because celebrating alone began to feel safer. You started saving those moments in your head like private keepsakes. You told yourself they were for you, that your happiness didn't need validation. But somewhere beneath that, You missed being met with enthusiasm. You missed being mirrored by someone who genuinely cared. Eventually, even big moments pass in silence. You accomplish something, and no one knows. You cross a milestone, and no one says anything. You stop mentioning things because you've learned the applause only comes when people want to hear it, not when you need to share it. And the silence that follows a vulnerable joy feels more painful than never saying anything at all. So you stop announcing things. You stop expecting cheer. You learn how to smile by yourself, quietly, without looking up. And eventually, you stop smiling too. Trigger 28. When you start speaking less because you assume no one's really listening. You didn't always feel this way. There was a time when you'd speak freely, even about small things. What you thought, how you felt, what was on your mind. You weren't always loud, but you were present. You contributed. You believed your voice added something to the room. But slowly, that belief started to wear down. You'd talk, and people would interrupt, or look past you, or nod politely, but not engage. You'd share something, and the topic would change within seconds. You'd offer a thought, and it would be ignored until someone else said it louder. You started noticing how easily you could be invisible, even while speaking. You told yourself not to take it personally. People are busy. Conversations move fast. But repetition made it harder to brush off. And slowly, your internal dialogue began to shift. Instead of, maybe they missed it, you started thinking, it probably wasn't worth saying. Instead of, I should repeat that, you thought, it doesn't matter. So you began to speak less. You offered shorter answers. You waited longer before jumping into a conversation. Eventually, you stopped offering thoughts unless asked. You didn't want to take up space that no one seemed to notice was yours to begin with. People don't notice the change. Why would they? You've trained yourself to fill the silence without sound. You nod. You smile. You pretend to be part of it. But inside, you're gone. Not angry. Not sad. Just no longer interested in the effort of being heard. This is the trigger. When you stop believing your voice makes a difference, and start choosing silence, not as peace, but as surrender. Trigger 29. When you realize you've become easier to be around when you're not honest. At some point, you notice that things go smoother when you keep your real thoughts to yourself. Conversations feel lighter. People smile more. There's less friction. You nod at things you don't agree with. You laugh at jokes you find uncomfortable. You offer surface-level opinions. Stay vague, and watch how easily the world accommodates you. It didn't start out as a lie. You just soften the edges. You learn that telling the truth, how you really feel, what you actually think, creates tension. People push back. They misinterpret. They take it personally, or they withdraw. And suddenly, your honesty becomes a liability. So you begin trimming yourself down. You give less of your real reactions. You present a version that's easier to digest. One that doesn't question or complicate. And people like it. They like you more. They say you're chill, that you're easygoing, that you're nice to talk to. But you know what it really is. It's not connection, it's convenience. They're enjoying your silence, not your soul. And the more you suppress, the easier it becomes to disappear behind the mask. You give them what they want, and keep what's real to yourself. Not to deceive, but to avoid the emotional cost of authenticity. Eventually, you stop trusting your truth to survive in conversation. You stop offering it. You stop believing it belongs anywhere but inside. And the version of you that remains? Quiet, smooth, forgettable, but socially perfect. Trigger 30. When you stop feeling like support means connection. You're not technically alone. You have people around you, family, acquaintances, even close friends. People check in. Some offer help. You get messages that say, thinking of you. I'm here if you need anything. And you've got this. On the surface, you're surrounded. People mean well. But none of it lands. You hear the words. You know what they're supposed to mean. But emotionally, they don't touch anything inside. At first, you blame yourself. Maybe you're too guarded. Too detached. Maybe you've gotten so used to doing things alone that you've forgotten how to receive help. You try harder. You respond politely. You smile when someone shows concern. You thank them. Say you appreciate it. Tell them it means a lot. But it doesn't. Not because they're doing it wrong, but because your connection to those gestures feels severed. You register the intent, but not the impact. You start noticing the difference between being surrounded and being seen, between being helped and being understood. You realize people are offering what they know how to offer, but it doesn't match what you actually need. And you don't blame them. You don't get angry, but you start pulling back, not out of resentment, but out of emotional economy. You conserve your energy for silence, because even when someone checks in, it often feels more like a task they're performing than a doorway to something deeper. You test this theory. You drop small hints in conversations. You reveal fragments. Nothing dramatic, just enough to see if anyone steps closer. They don't, or they miss it entirely, or they acknowledge it and move on. And so you start expecting less. You show less of yourself. You respond with fine, okay, tired. You keep the truth small so you don't have to grieve its dismissal. Eventually, you stop seeing support as connection. You see it as politeness, as protocol, as something people do to feel helpful. Even when they don't know how to hold what you're really carrying, you go through the motions. But the hope behind your replies fades. You realize that being surrounded isn't the same as being known. That care, in words, isn't always care in presence. And once that difference becomes clear, you stop trying to feel better in rooms that only make you lonelier. Trigger 31. When you realize you're always the one who keeps the connection alive, you start to track the pattern without meaning to. Every text thread begins with your message. Every hangout is your idea. Every birthday remembered. Every check-in. Every just thinking of you. It's all you. You're the thread pulling the whole thing together. And if you stop pulling, the whole thing unravels. At first, you don't mind. It feels good to care. You like being the one who remembers, the one who reaches out, the one who holds the emotional glue between people. But slowly, the imbalance starts to weigh on you. You test it. You stop messaging for a while. You don't initiate. You wait, and the silence grows. Days pass, then weeks. No messages. No calls. No small hey, you okay? Just space. Empty and quiet. You scroll through the conversations that used to be full and realize how many of them only lived because you breathed into them. Without your energy, your reminders, your presence, they go dormant. Like they were never really mutual, just convenient. You start to see it everywhere. At work, in family dynamics, in your closest friendships. If you don't show up, the relationship stalls. No one notices your absence right away. Or worse, they notice, but assume it's your job to fix the silence, to return, to carry the weight again. This realization doesn't come with anger. It comes with fatigue, a kind of emotional burnout. You no longer want to keep every connection alive with your own effort. You no longer feel proud of being the reliable one, the thoughtful one, the consistent one. You start to wonder what it would feel like to be checked on without asking, to be remembered without reminding, to matter without maintaining. And once that wondering takes root, your desire to maintain the performance of connection disappears. You stop initiating. You stop chasing. You let things die if they need to, not out of spite, but out of truth, because you've finally accepted that some relationships only exist if you hold both ends. Trigger 32. When you realize you're always the listener, never the one being heard. You've made it your role. The reliable ear, the calm voice, the patient nod. You're the person others go to when things fall apart. You've trained yourself to hold their grief, their doubt, their endless spiral of worry, and you've done it so well. They no longer even question whether you might need someone to do the same for you. You've become safe, predictable, grounded, unshakable. That's who you are to them. And so, when something in you starts to crack, when the stress builds, when the sadness seeps in, When the silence grows heavier, you don't know where to put it. You try to drop hints. You sound a little off. You pause more in conversation. You hope they'll notice. But they don't. Or they do. And they keep talking anyway. You're the listener. That's your position. If you stopped listening, the room might fall apart. You start to feel hollow. You give so much space to others that you shrink inside your own life. You know what it feels like to comfort, but you've forgotten what it feels like to be comforted. You know what it's like to support, but not to be supported. People thank you, admire you, say they don't know what they'd do without you, but none of them ask, "What do you need?" You begin to wonder if they'd still come to you if you were messy, if you cried, if you broke, if you admitted you were no longer holding it together. And that wondering becomes resentment. Not explosive, just a slow erosion of the role you once wore with pride. Eventually, you stop waiting to be heard. You hold your own weight. You bury your pain deeper. Not because you want to suffer in silence, but because you know the silence is yours alone to keep. And in their eyes, you're still the strong one, always listening, never breaking, forever quiet. Trigger 33. When you realize you feel less alone in your thoughts than around people. There's a strange comfort you begin to notice. You're walking home, scrolling your phone, staring at the wall, lying in bed alone, and it doesn't feel empty. It feels quiet, peaceful, even. You spend time with your thoughts, replaying moments, analyzing feelings, asking questions you won't answer, and somehow, you feel more present than when you're around people who claim to know you. You didn't always prefer solitude. There was a time when company meant safety, when conversation meant comfort, but too many shallow interactions, too many half-listened confessions, too many nods without follow-up turned that space into noise. Being around others started to feel like performing, like wearing your personality like a rented suit, like smiling for someone else's comfort while your own thoughts go unnoticed. So you retreat. You start turning down invitations. You stop filling silence with small talk. You don't feel guilty about missing out, because you're not missing anything. Inside your head, things feel real. Even the messy parts. Even the sadness. At least they're yours. At least they're not being diluted by someone trying to fix you with cliches. You begin to look forward to time alone. Not because you're antisocial, but because it's the only place where you don't have to translate yourself. You don't have to shrink your pain. You don't have to decorate your honesty with smiles. You can just exist. Eventually, solitude becomes your language. You stop offering parts of yourself in places where they'll be skimmed over. You stop performing for people who only know how to respond, not how to understand. And the loneliest thing isn't being alone. It's being misunderstood with company. Trigger 34. When you realize you're always the one managing the emotional temperature. In every group, every relationship, every interaction, there's a role you end up playing, whether you choose it or not. You're the one who senses tension before it's spoken, the one who diffuses it with a joke, who shifts topics when things get too heavy, who keeps the peace when emotions start bubbling. You've trained yourself to manage emotional weather like it's your job. You notice moods. You adapt. You soften your words. You lower your needs. You make people feel at ease, even when you're unraveling inside. You're praised for your calm, your awareness, your ability to read the room. But that praise doesn't feel like a compliment anymore. It feels like a sentence, because you've become the emotional buffer between people and discomfort, and no one ever asks how that's affecting you. You begin to notice how exhausting it is to keep everyone emotionally steady, how you anticipate reactions before they happen, how you rehearse every message, every conversation, not to express yourself, but to avoid creating waves. You stop expressing frustration. You pretend you're fine. You monitor your face in conversations to make sure no one worries. Over time, your own emotions shrink. You stop even noticing them. You spend so much time managing the room that you forget to check in with yourself. What do you feel? What do you need? The questions feel unfamiliar. Eventually, the performance becomes muscle memory. You keep smiling. You keep smoothing things over. You keep holding it together. And no one ever realizes you're doing it alone. Trigger 35. When you learn that vulnerability isn't always met with care, it's met with discomfort. You're told that honesty is strength. That vulnerability builds connection. That speaking your truth is the first step to healing. So one day, you try. You drop the mask. You share the truth. You let the guard down. Not all the way, but enough. You say the thing. Admit the ache. Show the crack. And then you wait for the response. But what comes isn't care. It's discomfort. The conversation shifts. The reply is vague. They say something kind, but distant. They make a joke. They nod too quickly. They look for a way out. You see it in their eyes. They weren't ready for this version of you. They like the lighter one, the easier one. You feel it in your stomach. That sudden pang of exposure. Like you've shown something you weren't supposed to. Not because it was wrong, but because they didn't know what to do with it. You promise yourself you'll never do it again. You return to safety, to vague replies, to the small, manageable parts of your life, the parts that make others comfortable. You learn that being real isn't always welcomed, it's tolerated. And that tolerance is colder than silence. Over time, your vulnerability becomes private again. You talk to yourself. You write things down. You let the heavy parts sit quietly in the background while you play the version of you people prefer. And the worst part is, no one ever notices the part of you they missed, because they never stayed long enough to see it in the first place. Trigger 36. When you start feeling more exhausted by connection than by solitude, it begins with a pause, a tiny hesitation before answering a text, a delay in replying to a message that would have once made you smile. At first, you think it's just burnout or a busy day, but the pause returns. Again and again, you find yourself staring at your screen longer. You hear the buzz of your phone and don't reach for it. You make plans and cancel them, not out of malice, just out of fatigue. This isn't the kind of tired that sleep fixes. It's the kind of tired that comes from constantly showing up. The effort of maintaining connection, being emotionally available, present, responsive, starts to wear you down. You feel it in the way your replies get shorter, in the way conversations begin to feel more like obligation than joy. You used to find comfort in talking. Now, even the lightest interactions feel like another thing to carry. You start to crave silence, not because it's peaceful, but because it's honest. Solitude doesn't ask for your attention. It doesn't expect you to perform, to hold space, to be anything other than what you are. And when people reach out, people you care about, people who mean well, you still answer. But the answers aren't whole. They're trimmed down versions of what you really feel. You begin to notice how much emotional work goes into every "how are you?" You no longer feel like explaining. You no longer feel like managing reactions or reassuring people that you're okay. It's not that you're not okay. It's that being okay has started to cost you more than you can afford to spend. So you start keeping more to yourself. Not because you don't want connection, but because you no longer have the energy to sustain it. Eventually, the loneliness of solitude feels lighter than the exhaustion of engagement. You choose the quiet. You let messages sit unanswered. You watch the calls ring out. You find peace in doing nothing, saying nothing, explaining nothing. And when people say they miss the old you, the one who showed up all the time, you realize you miss them too. But you miss you more. Trigger 37. When you stop expecting anyone to understand the kind of tired you carry, you've run out of ways to say it. I'm tired doesn't cover it. Burned out sounds too professional. Sad doesn't land right. And numb sounds dramatic. So you stop saying anything. You keep it short. All good. Just tired. Nothing much. And people nod. Accept it. Move on. They assume it's manageable. But it's not. It's not just in your body. It's in your bones. It's in your voice. It's in the way everything, even joy, feels far away. You've tried fixing it. You've slept more, eaten better, exercised. You've taken breaks, said no to plans. Tried journaling. None of it changes the internal static, the dull hum of emotional weight that never seems to lift. You function, you move, you reply. But inside, there's a disconnect that won't go away. People mean well. They offer tips. They tell you to slow down, breathe, focus on the positives. And you nod, smile, say thanks. You appreciate the effort, but none of it helps. Because the tiredness isn't about effort. It's about carrying too much, too quietly, for too long. So you stop trying to explain. You give them what they expect. You laugh when appropriate. You say you're okay. Because the truth makes people uncomfortable. They don't know what to do with someone who isn't visibly falling apart, but isn't fine either. Eventually, you learn to live with the tiredness. You build a routine around it. You stop expecting it to go away. It becomes the lens through which you see everything, even love, even joy, even hope. And when someone asks what's wrong, you say, nothing, just tired. Because the truth is too heavy for a conversation and too familiar to be shared again. Trigger 38. When you start choosing the comfort of routine over the risk of feeling again, it happens quietly. You stop chasing newness. You start finding comfort in repetition. The same routes, the same meals, the same songs on loop. There's no declaration, no sudden shift, just a gradual withdrawal from unpredictability. You used to say yes. Now, you wait. You used to try new things. Now, you hesitate. You tell yourself it's about simplicity, but deep down, it's about safety. You've been burned by change. You've been lifted by hope only to fall harder. You've let new people in, only to be reminded that not everyone stays. You've opened your heart, and the silence that followed still echoes in places you can't describe. So you stop making room for surprises. You live smaller. You choose predictability not because it's exciting, but because it hurts less. The routine becomes armor. You know what to expect. You control your exposure to anything that might crack you open again. Invitations go unanswered. Emotions get delayed. Excitement feels dangerous. And even happiness comes with a warning label. This will not last. You become hard to reach. Not physically, but emotionally. You're present, but not really there. You respond, but never reveal. You go through the motions with precision, but no pulse. People say you seem calm, stable, grounded, and in a way, you are. You've built a life that doesn't shake anymore, but it also doesn't move. And when you realize that safety has started to cost you aliveness, you wonder if you made the right trade. Then you return to your routine, because wondering is still safer than risking anything new. Trigger 39. When you stop offering opinions because you're tired of being talked over. At some point, you start measuring your words before you speak, not because you're unsure of what you think, but because you already know how the room will respond. You've noticed the pattern. You say something, and it's ignored. Someone else says the same thing louder. Later, and everyone nods. You express something with nuance, and someone flattens it into a soundbite, misunderstanding you completely. You try again. A new setting, a different group. Maybe this time, you'll be heard. But it's the same choreography. You watch people talk over you, interrupt, correct what you didn't say, or simply move on without responding at all. Eventually, it doesn't feel worth it. Not because your thoughts aren't valuable, but because the effort to express them feels like a losing game. You begin to shrink your voice. You speak only when asked. You keep your ideas soft, general, uncontroversial. You laugh at things that aren't funny just to stay in rhythm. You let someone explain something to you that you already understand, because correcting them would take more energy than it's worth. You start leaving conversations with a strange sense of hollowness. Not because you weren't present, but because no one noticed that you were. People describe you as quiet now, as agreeable, as easy to talk to, and part of you resents that. Not because it's untrue, but because it's not the whole truth. You have things to say. You just stopped believing anyone wanted to hear them. Eventually, You stop offering yourself to rooms that only value volume. You stop performing comprehension for people who don't reciprocate it. You keep your opinions to yourself, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. And in that silence, something inside you slowly disappears. Trigger 40. When you realize you're the first to apologize even when you're not wrong. It begins as a reflex. Someone's upset, and your immediate response is to say, "I'm sorry," not because you caused it, but because you want to fix it. You want to smooth the friction. You want to end the tension. You think, maybe if I take responsibility, things will calm down. Maybe if I apologize, we'll go back to normal. And for a while, it works. You say sorry even when the situation is murky, even when you're hurt too, even when the blame isn't yours. You do it so often it becomes a habit, a script you recite before the story even ends. You start to notice that people let you. They accept your apology without question. They let you take the fall. They rarely say, "No, that wasn't your fault." You wonder if they even think about whether it was. You begin to realize that they've come to expect it, that you'll be the one who bends, who softens, who absorbs the discomfort. So you keep doing it, even when it makes you bitter, even when it erodes your confidence, even when it teaches you, over time, that keeping peace is more important than keeping self-respect. Then one day, something small happens. You're interrupted, dismissed, blamed, and you almost say it, "I'm sorry," but you catch yourself. You realize the words were never about guilt. They were about survival. You said sorry to keep people from leaving, to avoid confrontation, to stay in control of the emotional weather. Eventually, you stop apologizing, not because you're stubborn, but because you're tired of sacrificing your truth for temporary calm. And when people ask what changed, you say, "Nothing." But inside, everything did. Trigger 41. When you stop hoping people will ask how you really are, and just start saying you're fine. There's a moment you remember clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. Someone asked, "How are you?" and you paused. You thought about telling them the truth, that you hadn't been sleeping, that your chest felt heavy, that you'd lost track of the last time you felt like yourself. But something in their tone told you they weren't really asking. So you smiled and said, "I'm fine." And they nodded. They moved on. Conversation continued. That moment didn't break you. It trained you. You learned how to answer questions that weren't really questions. You learned how to keep your voice light, your smile automatic, your truth buried just deep enough that it wouldn't ruin the rhythm of things. You became fluent in surface-level conversation, skilled at making others comfortable with your discomfort. You began to treat "how are you" like a formality, a checkpoint, not a doorway. And when people say, "You can talk to me anytime," you believe they mean it. But you also know that people only want certain truths, the edited kind, the type they can offer advice to, the kind that wraps up in a bow before the next topic change. Eventually, you stop even thinking about saying more. The emotional muscle it takes to consider being honest starts to atrophy. You respond before you think. Fine. Good. All right. You hear yourself say it and know it's a placeholder, not a report, and no one notices. Or if they do, they don't ask. And the worst part, you don't blame them. You wouldn't know what to do with the real answer either. Trigger 42. When you stop letting yourself get angry because it never goes anywhere safe. You feel it rising, the burn in your chest, the shake in your voice, the heat behind your eyes. Anger, not rage, not fury, just that deep internal signal that something isn't right, that something needs to be said, that you've been overlooked, hurt, pushed aside one too many times. You open your mouth to say something, to express it, but then you pause. And you swallow it, because you already know what happens when you get angry. It won't be met with understanding. It won't be met with repair. It'll be labeled overreacting, too sensitive, negative energy. You've seen what anger does in the hands of someone who's been dismissed. It becomes fuel for judgment. It becomes the reason people walk away. not the reason they stay, and fix what they broke. So you learn to suppress it, to smile instead, to explain calmly when your voice wants to rise, to say it's fine when it's absolutely not. You become skilled at downplaying, at finding other words, softer ones. You learn to protect others from your reactions, even when your reactions are justified. Over time, the anger doesn't disappear. It just turns inward. It folds into you like a toxin. You find yourself irritated by things that don't matter. You find yourself withdrawing not because you're distant, but because you're full. There's no room left to absorb more. And the worst part is, no one even knows you're mad. They think you're fine. They think you're chill. They think you're unbothered. But inside, you're burning with words you never said. Eventually, you stop letting yourself feel the anger at all. Not because it's wrong, but because you know it has nowhere to go that won't cost you more than silence. Trigger 43. When you start feeling like people only come to you when they need something. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts subtly. Someone reaches out after a long time, but only to ask for a favor. Another friend shares their crisis, vents for an hour, and doesn't ask a single thing about your life. A coworker suddenly gets warm and friendly when they need help with a task. You shrug it off at first. You want to be helpful. It feels good to be needed, until it doesn't. You begin to realize how many of your conversations revolve around someone else's timeline. You begin to track how often people reach out only when they're low, or stuck, or want something from you. And you start to notice the pattern. You're a resource, not a person. You're support, not presence. You're always listening, always holding, always offering, but rarely received in return. You tell yourself not to be bitter. You remind yourself they mean well. But the emptiness builds. You start to feel like your phone is a siren, only ringing when someone's in trouble. When things are good, they vanish. When they're done venting, the connection ends. You test it. You don't reply right away. You don't ask the follow-up question. You don't offer advice. And suddenly, the conversation stops. No one checks in. No one circles back. You realize that without your effort, the connection falls apart. So you stop trying. You stop giving. Not completely, but carefully. You begin to ration yourself. You draw boundaries. Not out of cruelty, but because you're tired of feeling disposable. And the next time someone reaches out with a, "Hey, can I ask you something?" you already know the answer. Trigger 44. When you start believing that your absence would be easier for everyone. It begins as a question, a passing thought. Would anything actually change if I wasn't around? You don't mean it dramatically. You're not imagining disappearing, just stepping back, being quieter, less involved. You wonder if anyone would notice, if anything would shift in their routine, in their mood, in their day. At first, you shake it off. Of course people care. Of course you matter. But the thought keeps coming back. You start to test it, pulling away gently. You don't comment in the group chat. You don't show up to the call. You don't share your update. And nothing happens. No follow-up. No question. No, "Hey, we missed you." So you keep stepping back, a little more each time. And still, the silence stays. Not cruel, just indifferent. That's what hurts the most. Not being hated, not being rejected, just not being thought about at all. You start believing that your presence was more work for people, that your needs, your stories, your struggles required too much effort, that your emotional weight was something they politely carried but never really wanted. So you lighten their load. You keep it all to yourself. You make yourself easy, low maintenance, invisible. Eventually, you start treating your own presence as optional. You sit in rooms and say little. You're in conversations, but never the focus. You let people talk around you, over you, past you, and when they finally notice your silence, it's too late, because you've already started to believe that your absence might actually be more comfortable for them than your presence ever was. Trigger 45. When you begin lowering your expectations so you're not disappointed again. It starts small. You stop expecting people to show up on time. You stop hoping someone will remember your birthday. You stop assuming that when someone says, let's hang out, they actually mean it. Not because you're cynical, but because disappointment has taught you how to protect yourself. The lower your expectations, the softer the fall. You used to give people the benefit of the doubt. You believed in follow-through. You trusted words. But too many letdowns begin to erode that trust. Plans that never happen. Promises that don't stick. Messages that go unanswered. You start telling yourself it's better to expect nothing than to expect something and be hurt again. So you start adjusting. Not loudly. Not in a way anyone notices. You smile and nod when someone says, "We should talk more." You respond kindly to vague enthusiasm. But inside, you mark it as empty. You no longer believe the moment will stretch into something real. You assume things will fade. And most of the time, they do. It seeps into everything. Relationships, work, family. You brace for disappointment before it arrives. You prepare for silence even as someone speaks with warmth. You stop getting excited when someone offers support, because experience has shown you how quickly support turns into distance. Eventually, it becomes second nature. You don't even feel the drop anymore, because you never let yourself climb. You stop waiting for people to be better. You stop hoping they'll follow through. You make your world smaller, quieter, more manageable, less room for hurt, less room for surprise. And while it may look like acceptance, deep down, you know what it really is: a decision to expect less so that you feel less. Not because you've healed, but because hope started costing more than it was worth. Trigger 46. When you start hiding good news because it only highlights what others don't have. You receive good news. Something small. Maybe. A job opportunity. A compliment. A quiet personal win. Your first instinct is to share it. To tell someone who matters to you. To celebrate. But just before you do, something stops you. A pause. A whisper. You remember how uncomfortable it can make people when you're happy. You think about the friend who's struggling to find work. The sibling who's still stuck in the same place. The person who recently told you they feel like nothing ever goes right for them. You imagine how your happiness might sound to them. Loud, thoughtless, unfair. So you say nothing. You downplay. You shrug it off. It's not a big deal. I just got lucky. It might not even work out. You chip away at your own joy until there's nothing left to react to. You flatten the win before anyone else has the chance to. This isn't about humility. It's about survival. You've learned that joy makes people uncomfortable. That sharing something good risks alienating people you care about. That your success is only safe if it's hidden, or disguised, or softened. You don't want to seem arrogant. You don't want to seem oblivious. You don't want anyone to feel worse because of your better. Eventually, the excitement starts to fade before it even forms. You receive good news, and your first thought isn't celebration. It's strategy. Who can handle hearing this? Who will take it well? Who will resent it, even silently? You become skilled at keeping joy inside, at nodding politely when someone says, "That's great," but never lingering there too long. And over time, even you stop feeling it fully, because you've trained yourself not to shine too brightly in a room where everyone's eyes are already tired. Trigger 47. When you stop correcting people's misunderstandings because it's easier to be misread. You hear someone mention something about you, a detail, a belief, a version of an event. It's not true, or at least, not fully. You want to jump in and correct it, to say, "That's not what happened," or "That's not who I am." But you don't. You pause. You let it slide, because you've learned that correcting people rarely fixes the misunderstanding. It just shifts the tension. People double down. They defend what they thought. They question your motives. Sometimes they make you feel like the problem. So now, you just stay quiet. Let them think what they want. You start noticing how many people have versions of you that don't align with who you really are. Some see you as too sensitive. Others think you're cold. Some think you're distant when you're just guarded. Some think you're fine when you're falling apart. And you realize how exhausting it would be to correct them all. So you stop trying. You let the narratives live. You nod when someone says, "You've always been so strong," even when you feel weak. You agree when they say, "You're so chill," even though you haven't felt calm in months. You play the part, not because it's true, but because challenging it feels pointless. Over time, people start relating to a version of you that doesn't exist. And rather than disrupt that, you lean into it. You let them engage with the surface. Because the surface is easier. It's predictable. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't require you to explain how complicated you've become. Eventually, even you forget what's underneath. And the truth sits untouched, not hidden, just quietly ignored. Because being misread is less painful than being exposed and dismissed all over again. Trigger 48. When you start avoiding conversations that require you to talk about yourself. It begins with small talk. Someone asks, "What have you been up to?" And you freeze, not because you don't have an answer, but because the real answer feels too heavy, too complicated, too disappointing. You say something vague. Not much. Just keeping busy. You smile, nod, and redirect the question. "What about you?" And just like that, you're safe again. You didn't used to be like this. You liked telling stories. You enjoyed reflecting out loud, piecing your life into something shareable. But now, you hesitate. Every question feels like a trap, not because others intend it that way, but because your life no longer feels like something worth narrating. Or maybe because explaining it means admitting things you've tried to avoid. You begin to dread meaningful conversations. You avoid catching up with old friends. You pull away from people who knew you before the silence started. Because eventually, they'll ask. They'll want an update. They'll expect some sign of progress, clarity, growth. And you're not sure you can give that. Or worse, you're not sure they'll understand if you say, "Nothing's really changed. I still feel stuck." So you keep things light. You become skilled at flipping questions back on others. You become the listener, the observer, the one who doesn't interrupt. And people love that. They say you're so easy to talk to, so thoughtful, so understanding. They don't notice how rarely you share anything real anymore. And even when they ask, you give them the polished version, the one that keeps things moving. Eventually, you start forgetting what it feels like to be honest. You lose touch with how to tell your story. Because every time you edit yourself, every time you shrink your truth down into a safe, palatable sentence, you drift a little further from being known. And the scariest part is, you don't even mind anymore. Trigger 49. When you realize you're only appreciated when you're not struggling. You notice it one day when you're having a bad week. You're quieter, slower to reply, not as warm in your responses. And you can feel it, the shift. People grow distant. Conversations dry up. You're no longer as easy to talk to. No longer the helpful, energetic, optimistic version of yourself they've come to rely on. And without that version of you present, they quietly step back. You remember a time when you were praised for your energy, your cheerfulness, your reliability. You were the strong one, the light, the rock in many people's lives. It felt good, being appreciated. But now, you look at those compliments with a different lens. You realize they were conditional. Not appreciation of you, but appreciation of what you gave. You test it. You show a crack. You say, "I'm not doing great." The room goes quiet. People respond with surface sympathy. Then shift the topic. You try again. Another time. "I'm tired lately. It's been hard." Someone nods. But you can see it in their eyes. They're uncomfortable. They liked you better when you were easier. So you retreat. You clean yourself up before showing up. You put the smile back on. You talk less about what's real and more about what's expected. You give people the version of you they like. The one that's useful, uplifting, low maintenance. And over time, that's all that's left. A you that's appreciated, but never truly known. Trigger 50. When you start believing that you're the one making things harder by existing. You don't know when it started. Exactly. Maybe after one too many eye rolls when you asked a question. Maybe after a long silence following an honest message. Maybe after you cried in front of someone, and they looked more inconvenienced than concerned. Somewhere along the way, you began to internalize the idea that your feelings, your presence, your voice were friction, not connection. You stopped talking about what hurt. You started cleaning up your emotions before presenting them to others. You practiced being brief, being easy, being invisible. You apologized too often. You prefaced everything with sorry if this is too much. You shrank yourself into a version you hoped would be easier to receive. But no matter how small you made yourself, something still felt off. You'd speak, and the air in the room would shift. You'd share something, and someone would sigh, or change the subject, or offer a quick solution instead of listening. And you began to wonder, not if something was wrong with them, but if maybe the problem was you. That's when the belief settled in. I'm the reason this is hard. If I said less, needed less, took up less space, everything would run smoother. So you complied. You began to erase yourself before others had the chance to. You made decisions alone. You cried in private. You rehearsed conversations in your head and never said them out loud. You stopped showing up fully because you assumed you were a complication. And eventually, you stop asking, will they accept me? You just start assuming they won't. Trigger 51. When you start pretending you're busy so you don't have to connect. You used to welcome the ping of a message. You'd answer with warmth. You'd carve out time for people. You made effort feel easy. But now, every call feels like a commitment you can't keep. Every invite feels like an emotional tax. You haven't grown cold. You've just grown tired of pretending to be present when you're not. So you start using distance as a shield. You don't respond right away, not because you're busy, but because you need space. You say, I'm swamped, even when you're just staring at the wall. You blame work, errands, exhaustion, anything but the truth. That connection no longer feels like a recharge. It feels like another thing to manage. It's not that you don't care. You do. But caring doesn't mean you have the capacity. You know how the conversations will go, how you'll smile, engage, laugh on cue. You'll say the right things and feel nothing. You'll leave the interaction more drained than when you began. And so you avoid, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. People start to notice. They say you've been distant. You say, just busy. They nod. They accept it. Because everyone's busy. No one questions that excuse. It's the perfect cover for slow withdrawal. And over time, it becomes a habit. You fill your calendar with noise to protect yourself from emotion. You create routines that shield you from unpredictability. You leave messages on read because answering means explaining. And there's nothing left to explain that doesn't sound like failure. Eventually, even you start to believe the lie that you're just overwhelmed, just working too hard, just in need of rest. But underneath it, the truth is simpler. Connection asks too much from someone who no longer feels like they're all there. Trigger 52. When you learn to laugh off pain so no one sees it clearly. You say it with a smile. It is what it is. Could be worse. Just my luck. The words are light, almost funny. And that's the point. You've turned discomfort into a performance. You've learned that if you laugh while saying it, no one asks questions. No one digs deeper. They laugh too. They move on. And you're spared the awkwardness of being truly seen. At first, it felt like a strategy, a way to make people comfortable, a way to make pain manageable. If you could keep it casual, you wouldn't scare anyone off. But over time, it became a reflex. You felt the ache, but dressed it in humor. You felt the weight, but called it irony. And the real stuff, the tender, difficult, quiet parts, never made it to the surface. People began to describe you as resilient, strong, easygoing. They admired how you never let things get to you. You accepted the praise, even as it chipped away at your ability to be honest. Because you weren't unbothered, you were hiding, and no one noticed. You tested it once. Let the mask slip. Said something real. Something sharp and quiet and true. The conversation went silent. Someone offered a joke. Another changed the subject. And that moment taught you more than any compliment ever could. Real pain makes people uncomfortable, and discomfort makes people disappear. So you went back to laughing, back to shrugging. You mastered the art of the self-deprecating joke. You learned how to deflect. You became a mirror, reflecting only what others were comfortable seeing. And now, even when something truly hurts, your first instinct isn't to express it. It's to rewrite it into something small, digestible, and forgettable. So they never see the wound, just the grin covering it. Trigger 53. When you begin to believe that needing anything makes you unlovable, it's a quiet shift. You start noticing how much easier people are to be around when you need nothing, when you're low maintenance, when you keep your emotions clean and your presence light. People call you chill, easy, strong. They love you for how little you ask of them. And slowly, you start to equate that with value. You start believing that the less you need, the more you're worth. That being self-sufficient is the only way to keep people close. That needing something, attention, comfort, reassurance, is what drives people away. So you adapt. You learn to offer without expecting. You listen without interrupting. You give without asking for anything back. And when the ache comes, the one that wants to be held, to be seen, to be asked, "What do you need?" you bury it. You remind yourself that love comes easier when you're simple, when you don't cause trouble, when you don't take up too much space. People praise you for it. They admire how independent you are, how strong, but they don't see the cost. They don't see how often you want to reach out and don't. How often you say, "I'm good," when you're not. How often you pretend you don't care that no one checked in. Eventually, you stop hoping. You stop looking for reciprocity. You stop believing that your needs are valid. Not because you're healed, but because it's safer to believe they were never allowed in the first place. And the more love you receive for being so easy to love, the more convinced you become that any real part of you would ruin everything. Trigger 54. When you stop hoping people will stay after seeing the real you, there's always that moment. The one where you debate whether or not to say it, to share something raw, something less polished, a fear, a failure, a deep insecurity. You hesitate, weigh it, measure it. Then, just once, you let the guard drop. You let someone see a little more. You tell the truth instead of the script. And then you wait. What happens next isn't always dramatic. Sometimes they smile awkwardly. Sometimes they nod and quickly change the subject. Sometimes they respond with silence. You tell yourself you're overreacting, that maybe it just caught them off guard, that they care, they just didn't know what to say. But part of you knows better. You've seen this before. The slow withdrawal, the subtle shift, the way their interest fades just a bit after they get too close. You start connecting the dots. You remember the ones who left after your honesty made them uncomfortable. You remember the judgment hidden in soft suggestions. The change in tone after you stopped being light and easy. And slowly, a new belief starts to take shape. Not that you're too much, but that you're safest when you give less. So you start keeping your truths tucked away. You perfect the art of being pleasant, of being doing fine. You show people only the parts of you that are digestible, manageable, lovable and small. Neat doses. And they respond better to that version. They stay. They smile. They tell you they're glad you're in their life. But deep down, a quiet grief grows. Because they're not in your life. They're in the life of the mask you built to keep them close. And over time, you stop expecting that anyone would choose to stay if they saw all of you. Not the fragments, not the softened edges, but the whole, complicated, unfiltered self you now hide as a form of emotional self-defense. Trigger 55. When you realize you're the first to forgive because you're afraid of being left. You tell yourself it's maturity, that it takes strength to let go, That forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. You repeat all the right phrases. It's not worth the grudge. They didn't mean to. People make mistakes. And maybe all of that is true. But there's another reason, one you don't say out loud. You forgive quickly because you're scared of what happens if you don't. You know how easily people leave. You've seen it. One fight, one boundary, one moment of disappointment, and they disappear. Not just physically, but emotionally. They pull back, change tone, rewrite the narrative, and suddenly, you're the problem for not letting it go. So you let it go. You fold your pain down into something polite. You say it's okay, even when it's not. People call you graceful, understanding, so emotionally intelligent. They admire how you never hold things against people, and you accept the praise, because the alternative is explaining that your forgiveness comes from fear, not peace. You've learned that holding people accountable risks losing them. That saying, "This hurt me," can be the start of the end. So you stay quiet. You smooth things over. You say, "I understand," instead of "I'm hurt." And over time, the people around you get used to the ease. They stop trying. They stop apologizing. They assume they're always forgiven because you never made it a question. Eventually, you stop expecting repair. You stop believing in mutual care. You forgive not because you want to, but because you've been taught that being upset makes you harder to love. So you sacrifice the confrontation, and piece by piece, you disappear into your own silence. Trigger 56. When you stop sharing your dreams because you're tired of them being dismissed. You used to talk about them openly. The things you wanted, the things you were building toward, even if they were far off, even if they sounded impossible, you believed in them. You held on to them like a thread guiding you forward. And you shared them with friends, with family, with people who said they cared. You said, "One day I'll do this," and waited for someone to say, "You can." But instead, what you got were smirks, cautious warnings, subtle discouragement disguised as concern. Are you sure that's realistic? You should have a backup plan. That sounds risky. You told yourself they meant well, that they were just trying to help. But eventually, you stopped feeling helped. You started feeling small. You began to share less. You edited yourself. You stuck to safe goals, the ones that made sense to others, the ones that didn't make them uncomfortable. And even then, you noticed the tone, the hesitations, the way people nodded, but without belief. And somewhere along the way, you stopped saying anything at all. Now, when someone asks what you want from life, you keep it simple, practical, boring. You say what sounds achievable, what won't be questioned, and you watch them accept it, finally comfortable, finally supportive, because you've shrunk your dream into something they can understand. But inside, that old dream still lingers. It didn't die. It just learned to live quietly, unspoken, unshared, hidden in the parts of you that no longer expect to be believed. Because hope, when dismissed too many times, becomes a secret, one that you no longer risk bringing into the light. Trigger 57. When you realize you're more comfortable being a background character in other people's lives. You used to want to be part of the center. You used to imagine close circles, loud laughter, people remembering you without being reminded. You tried to show up. You tried to speak, contribute, offer something real. But over time, something shifted. Not all at once, just slowly enough that you didn't fight it. You started hanging back, letting others talk, letting others be seen. And soon enough, you weren't at the table anymore. You were just nearby. You tell yourself it's humility, that you prefer listening, that it's nice to let others shine. But that's not really it. It's self-protection. You've seen what happens when you step into the light. You get misunderstood. You get interrupted. You get overlooked. Or worse, you get included out of pity. So you step back, further each time, until your presence starts to feel optional. People don't notice. Not because they don't care, but because they've adjusted to you being quiet, being easy, being supportive from the sidelines. They praise you for being so chill. They say you're such a good listener. And the compliments start to feel like labels. A way to define the version of you that doesn't take up too much space. You stop telling stories. You stop asking for space. You show up with a nod, a smile, and little else. And eventually, it becomes easier to be background. Easier to be the friend who's always there, but never the one anyone thinks of first. You become the safe one, the non-disruptive one, the one who blends in so well. Even you start forgetting what it feels like to be seen. And the worst part, you start preferring it that way. Not because you want to be invisible, but because visibility stopped feeling safe a long time ago. Trigger 58. When you start expecting people to leave the moment you get attached. There's a pattern you've memorized. It starts with connection, something rare, something that sparks, a conversation that flows, a sense that maybe this person sees you in a way others don't. You let your guard down slowly, cautiously, like someone who's been burned but still wants to believe. And just when it starts to feel stable, something shifts. They pull away, or you start bracing for them to. You tell yourself it's nothing. You rationalize. People get busy. People get distracted. But underneath the logic, you feel the familiar panic rise. You scan the past few interactions. You wonder what you did wrong. You start rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet. You begin preparing for the end, just in case. It doesn't matter if they actually leave. What matters is that you believe they will. You believe it so deeply that you start creating distance before they do. You reply slower. You share less. You stop asking questions. Not out of spite, but out of preemptive grief. You detach to protect yourself from a hurt that hasn't even arrived yet. And when they finally do fade, or don't, you've already adjusted. You've already erased the part of you that was hopeful. You've already made peace with being disappointed. Because for you, disappointment is easier than surprise. Easier than believing that someone might stay. Eventually, you stop expecting connection to last. You learn to enjoy it in moments, not futures. And when something begins to feel meaningful, you hold your breath, not out of awe, but out of dread. Because the closer someone gets, the louder the voice becomes. This won't last. Get ready. Trigger 59. When you only feel valued when you're useful to someone. You notice how much easier it is to be wanted when you're helping. When you're offering a ride, a task, a favor, a listening ear. People light up when you show up with something to give. They praise your reliability, your consistency, your generosity. You nod, you smile, but something about it doesn't sit right. You start testing it. You stop offering. You don't initiate. You let things unfold without inserting yourself. And the silence that follows isn't loud, it's indifferent. People don't check in. They don't ask if you're okay. They don't wonder why you've gone quiet. They simply continue, without the part of you they were benefiting from. That's when the realization hits. You've been teaching people that your value lives in your usefulness, that your presence is transactional, that you're more support system than person. You don't blame them. You train them to see you this way by always showing up, never asking for much, always being dependable even when you were falling apart. Now, when you're tired, when you're the one in need, it feels harder to ask for help. You fear becoming a burden. You fear being seen as needy. You fear that without something to offer, your presence won't be wanted. So you keep offering, even when it drains you. You keep giving, even when no one gives back. You keep being useful because it's the only time you feel needed. And over time, the question that grows louder isn't, who cares about me? It's, who would still want me around if I stopped being helpful? Trigger 60. When you begin feeling ashamed for wanting more than what you have. It starts with a small, private thought. You're in the middle of a conversation or scrolling through a string of messages. And you think, this isn't enough. Not in a greedy way. Not even in a way you can fully explain. You just feel a quiet ache, a restlessness that whispers, you were meant to feel more than this. But before that thought can fully form, another one comes barreling in, guilt. Because the life you have, by all accounts, is fine. People remind you constantly. You should be grateful. At least you're not struggling. It could be worse. And you nod. You agree. You echo the script. But inside, you're shrinking because your desire for more, for depth, for real joy, for emotional nourishment has started to feel like a flaw. You begin censoring yourself. You downplay your dissatisfaction. You pretend the small talk is enough. You nod when people say things that don't move you. You tell yourself you're the problem, that if you were more healed, more grounded, more present, you wouldn't feel so empty. You wouldn't feel so unseen. You wouldn't want more. But the wanting doesn't stop. It just hides. Over time, your ability to articulate what you need begins to fade. Not because you no longer feel it, but because you've internalized the idea that asking for more makes you ungrateful. You convince yourself that contentment means silence. That acceptance means settling. That maturity means learning how to shrink your needs until they fit inside someone else's comfort zone. Eventually, you stop looking for more. Not because you've found it, but because you've trained yourself to feel ashamed for even asking. And the silence that follows feels like peace on the outside, but like suffocation on the inside. Trigger 61. When you stop expecting anyone to really check in without a reason, you notice it over time. The way messages come only when someone needs something. The way calls are timed around tasks. The way even "how are you" starts sounding like a formality, a required step before the real purpose of the conversation kicks in. You reply. You smile. You show up. But something inside you starts to ache. You try to push the thought away. You tell yourself everyone's busy, that this is adulthood, that people don't mean to be distant, they're just overwhelmed. And maybe that's true. But it doesn't change the fact that you can't remember the last time someone reached out without a prompt, without a problem, without an ask. You begin to notice the imbalance. How you send messages just to check in. How you remember birthdays. How you follow up after hard conversations. And how rarely that energy is returned. At first, you tell yourself you're just more thoughtful, more emotionally attuned. But eventually, the thought you've been avoiding surfaces. No one is thinking about you when there's no need to. You don't say it out loud. You don't want to seem bitter. You keep giving, even when it hurts. You reply to their messages even when your own inbox stays empty. You carry the emotional weight of connections that only exist when you're the one doing the lifting. And then, without making a big decision, you start to let go. You stop checking in first. You stop sending reminders. You stop initiating conversations. And the silence that follows confirms what you already feared. The relationship only existed as long as you carried it. Eventually, you learn not to expect much. Not because you've grown cold, but because waiting for someone to reach out just to say, "I was thinking about you," started to feel like waiting for something that was never coming. Trigger 62. When you realize you're numbing yourself just to function like everyone else. There was a time when you felt things too deeply. A song could ruin your day. A kind word could make you cry. A disappointment could sit inside your chest like a stone. You were raw, open, constantly moved by the world. But slowly, something changed. Not by choice, but by necessity. You began to notice how inconvenient it was to feel everything so much. How it made conversations awkward. How it made you seem fragile, overly emotional. You saw how others seemed to glide through life with armor, unaffected, and you wanted that too. Not because you didn't feel, but because you were tired of feeling alone in it. So you started numbing, in small ways at first. Distraction, noise, overwork, a scroll, a snack, a silence, anything to blur the sharp edges of what you were carrying. And it worked. Sort of. You became more efficient, less reactive, more together. People began to describe you as calm, stable, doing well, but they didn't see what it cost. You started drifting. Conversations felt more like performances. Days blurred into routines. You laughed at the right times, but nothing landed. You spoke, but the words felt hollow. You functioned on time, in control, composed, but nothing touched you. Not really. And over time, the numbness became your baseline. You didn't feel the high highs, but you also didn't feel the crushing lows. You didn't break down, but you didn't come alive either. Eventually, you realized this wasn't balance. This wasn't peace. This was emotional anesthesia, a life lived under sedation, not because you wanted to disappear, but because you didn't know how else to survive in a world that seemed allergic to depth. Trigger 63. When you stop believing compliments because they always come too late. You hear the words kind, glowing, generous. You're amazing. You're so strong. You mean so much. But the timing always feels off. They say it when you're already pulling away, when the silence has grown too loud, when your presence has become an absence they finally notice. And by then, the compliments don't feel warm. They feel transactional, like attempts to patch a hole that's been widening for far too long. You start to question their meaning. Why didn't they say these things when you needed to hear them? When you were showing up, trying, giving? Why now, when you've grown quieter, more distant, more tired of proving your worth? You don't ask these questions out loud. You smile. You nod. You say thank you. But inside, you're sifting through the timeline, trying to trace what changed. Eventually, you begin to distrust praise altogether. You assume it's reactive, not sincere, a guilt reflex, a parting gift, something people say when they realize they may have taken you for granted. And instead of comfort, it stings, because the words you once would have clung to now feel like reminders of how invisible you were when it actually mattered. You stop fishing for feedback. You stop hoping people will acknowledge the effort. You do things because they need to be done, not because anyone will see them. And when the recognition comes, it's too late to mean anything. You've already decided that being seen in retrospect isn't being seen at all. So you carry yourself differently. Not colder, just quieter, more self-contained. You don't seek out validation anymore, not because you don't want it, but because you've learned how unreliable it is. And the next time someone says, "You're so appreciated," all you can think is, "Then why did it take me disappearing for you to say so?" Trigger 64. When you catch yourself saying, "I'm used to it," too easily. It slips out in conversation. Someone cancels plans. You say, "It's okay, I'm used to it." Someone forgets to check in. "I get it. I'm used to it." Someone interrupts, dismisses, forgets. And every time, the phrase comes out like a shield, a way to protect them from your disappointment, a way to protect yourself from expecting too much. At first, it sounds like resilience, like grace, like you're the kind of person who rolls with it. But the more you say it, the more it echoes. And then you realize, being used to it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It just means you've stopped reacting to the hurt because the pattern has become so familiar. You start tracing back how long you've been saying it, how long you've been excusing lateness, silence, absence. You remember how it used to sting, before the repetition numbed it, before the apology sounded the same every time, before you learned how to smile and say, "It's fine," while something inside you quietly folded itself smaller. Eventually, "I'm used to it" becomes your default setting. You apply it to everything. People forgetting your birthday, friends who never ask how you are, loved ones who only call when they need something. You don't even register it as neglect anymore. You register it as normal. And the worst part isn't the pain. It's the way you stopped believing it was worth mentioning. You become the person who never complains, who never makes a fuss, who never pushes back. And people get used to that version of you too, until even you forget that there was ever a time when you didn't accept crumbs as a full meal. Trigger 65. When you start dreading, "How have you been?" because you don't know what to say. It's such a harmless question. Friendly, casual, polite. How have you been? It should be easy. But every time someone asks, your mind goes blank. Not because you don't have an answer, but because none of the answers feel shareable. Too complicated, too heavy, too raw for the lightness the question expects. So you default. Good. You. Busy. But fine. Just taking things day by day. You say what people want to hear. What keeps the moment moving? What keeps the interaction smooth? Because you've learned that honesty doesn't belong in casual spaces. That real answers make things awkward. That telling the truth means watching someone shift in their seat. You think of everything you could say. That you've been detached. That you've been pretending. That your days blur together. That you feel like you're surviving more than living. But none of that fits in the space between greetings and small talk. So you lie. Not maliciously. Just strategically. You give people the version of you that's digestible. You don't want pity. You don't want concern. You don't want to explain yourself again. So you smile and move on. And they believe you. Or at least, they don't question it. Over time, the question starts to feel like a test. A chance to either perform or ruin the mood. And the moment it's asked, you tense. You rehearse. You shrink. Because answering truthfully isn't the hard part. It's dealing with what comes after. Trigger 66. When you feel like you're always the placeholder until someone better arrives. It doesn't happen in one moment. It happens over time. You start to notice how often you're the one in between. The one people turn to when they're lost. Uncertain. Rebuilding. They talk to you about their problems, their confusion, their last heartbreak. You become the bridge, the comfort before their next destination. And then they move on. At first, you convince yourself it's just coincidence, that you're a good listener, that you're someone people trust when they're broken. You tell yourself it's a compliment to be the safe space. But after the fourth, fifth, sixth time, the pattern becomes too obvious to ignore. They come in need, stay in gratitude, and leave in silence. You start to anticipate it, the shift, the moment their texts slow down, the way their energy fades as soon as their stability returns. You become emotionally fluent in goodbyes that never get spoken. You know when you've been replaced. You can feel it in their voice. You can sense it in the way your presence starts to feel like an obligation. And every time it happens, something in you shrinks. Not just because they're gone, but because you knew they would be. Because you've started to believe that you're not someone people stay with. You're someone they practice on. Someone they confide in until they've gathered themselves enough to go be someone else's real thing. Eventually, you stop trying to form deep connections. Not because you don't want them, but because you don't trust that you'll be chosen once the storm has passed. You stop opening up. You stop giving fully. You keep people at a distance because you've accepted your role. The soft shoulder before they find who they were really looking for. And the worst part isn't being left. It's realizing you were never the destination. They were just passing through. Trigger 67. When you pretend you're forgetful, so people don't realize you were hurt. You hear someone mention something you didn't know, something they didn't tell you. You see a photo from an event you weren't invited to. You read a message that sounds like it was never meant for you. And for a second, it stings. A sharp, cold awareness that you weren't thought of, that you weren't included, that you weren't important enough. But instead of confronting it, you pretend. You say you forgot the date, that you didn't see the invite, that you meant to check in, but time got away from you. You give them an out so they don't have to feel bad, so you don't have to be the one who looks wounded. Because you've learned what happens when you express hurt. It makes people uncomfortable. They deny, deflect, or worse, treat you like you're being dramatic. So you preempt all of it by acting unbothered. You rewrite your absence as forgetfulness, not exclusion. You smile through it, even as your stomach tightens. Over time, you become so good at this performance that even you start to believe it. You tell yourself you really didn't care, that it's better not to be involved, that maybe you were too busy anyway. You start building your self-worth around avoidance, around the lie that not being included doesn't matter. But it does. And the emotional residue doesn't disappear. It just settles deeper. In the silence, in the pretending, in the way you laugh it off and then go home and think about it for hours. Eventually, You stop expecting to be remembered. You stop waiting to be chosen. Not because you're above it, but because you've built your identity around not admitting that it still hurts. Trigger 68. When you always prepare to be blamed even before anything goes wrong. You notice it in your posture. The way your body stiffens when someone looks upset. The way your voice flattens when you start explaining something. You triple-check the details. You over-explain your intentions. You apologize before anyone's even had a chance to respond. Because in your head, you're already guilty of something. You weren't always like this. But over time, after enough misunderstandings, after being the one who was always blamed, always questioned, always doubted, you began to anticipate the accusation before it came. You stopped trusting that you'd be given the benefit of the doubt. So you took on the role of preemptive defense. You walk through life carefully, cautiously. You read people's moods like they're warning signs. You dissect their silences. You fill in the gaps before they become problems. And even when nothing is wrong, you still brace for impact. Because you've learned that calm moments don't mean safety, they mean delay. So you keep explaining. You overcompensate. You offer context that no one asked for. Not because you want to, because you're trying to survive. You want to stay ahead of the fallout. You want to prove, over and over again, that you're not at fault, that you're trying, that you're aware. But it never feels like enough. Eventually, you stop feeling innocent. Even when you've done nothing wrong, the guilt still follows. Not real guilt, learned guilt. Conditioned guilt. The kind that comes from being told one too many times that your actions, your tone, your presence were the problem. And so now, you apologize for being misunderstood before you've even had a chance to speak. Trigger 69. When you start lowering your voice because you've been told you're too much one too many times. You didn't start quiet. You used to speak with emotion, passion, conviction. You used to tell stories with your hands. Ask questions that made people shift in their seats. You weren't trying to be dramatic. You were just alive in your own skin. And then one day, someone said it. You're too much. Maybe they meant it as a joke. Maybe they meant it gently. Maybe they didn't mean anything at all. But it stuck. And after that, you began to adjust. You paused before reacting. You measured your words. You learned to soften your tone, to flatten your joy, to shrink your anger into something more acceptable. You learned to turn your volume down, metaphorically and literally. And the compliments came. You're so calm now. You've matured. You're much easier to be around. But it didn't feel like growth. It felt like erosion. Like you were sanding down the edges of who you were just to fit into a space that didn't want all of you. Over time, you lost your sense of scale. You couldn't tell what was too much and what was just honest. You started second-guessing every expression. You hesitated before laughing too loud, crying too visibly, or asking for more than was convenient. You didn't stop feeling, you just stopped showing. Eventually, even you began to forget what your full self sounded like. You became palatable, approachable, safe, and deeply, deeply edited. And the worst part, they liked you better this way. Trigger 70. When you start saying, it doesn't matter, just to end the conversation. You didn't always fold so easily. You used to explain, to clarify, to advocate for your feelings. But after enough blank stares, enough dismissive replies, enough moments when your words felt like echoes in an empty room, you learned to end the conversation before it ever really started. It doesn't matter. That's the sentence. Simple. Final. A wall. You say it not because it's true, but because continuing would require energy you no longer want to spend. It's easier to seem indifferent than to risk the disappointment of being unheard again. You try to believe it. You tell yourself you're just letting things go, that you've grown out of the need to be understood. That emotional self-control means silence. But inside, you're not calm, you're just tired. Tired of trying to translate your hurt into language that doesn't make people uncomfortable. You start noticing how often you say it. When someone hurts you, when plans change, when you're left out, When you bring up something important and the other person brushes past it, and you're left holding the discomfort alone, you want to continue. You want to say, no, it does matter. But you don't, because every time you did before, it led nowhere. So it doesn't matter becomes your shortcut, your emotional exit strategy. The way you protect yourself from the awkwardness of needing more than someone is willing to give. Eventually, you use it so often that even you start to believe it. And that's when it stops being a defense and becomes a belief. Trigger 71. When you start hiding how hard you're trying because no one notices anyway. You wake up earlier than they think. You check every detail twice. You go the extra step. Say the kind word. Make sure everyone else is comfortable, even when you're not. You do it quietly, automatically. It's not about recognition, at least not at first. But slowly, the silence starts to echo. No one says anything. No one notices the effort, the little things you hold together, the emotions you manage, the discomforts you swallow so others don't have to. You become a quiet background force that keeps things steady. And the steadier you are, the more invisible you feel. You tell yourself it's fine, that you're doing the right thing, that people don't need to see your effort for it to be valuable. But deep down, something begins to ache. Not because you want applause, but because you want someone, just once, to say, I see how hard you're trying. Instead, they say things like, you're so strong. You always have it together. You're lucky, you're just built that way. And you nod, because correcting them would take too much energy. Because showing how hard it really is would only make them uncomfortable. So you say nothing. You start hiding the struggle. You learn to smile with tired eyes, to laugh when your chest is tight, to say, I'm fine, even when every part of you is aching from the effort it takes just to keep moving through the day. Eventually, the dissonance wears on you. You begin to feel like a ghost in your own life. Present, useful, consistent, but hollow. Because the truth is, you're not naturally strong. You're just someone who's been carrying more than they can show, and pretending that's normal. Trigger 72. When you pretend you don't notice the shift in someone's energy just to avoid asking why. It starts as a subtle thing, a shorter reply, a slower response, a tone that doesn't sound quite the same. You feel the distance before it becomes visible. You sense the shift before it's ever spoken. And for a moment, you consider asking, is something wrong? Did I do something? Are we okay? But you don't, because you already know how that conversation goes. They'll say it's nothing, that everything's fine, that you're overthinking. You'll feel foolish for noticing, for caring, for being sensitive enough to detect what they've worked hard to hide. And so you stop yourself. You convince yourself it's better not to ask, that if something really mattered, they'd bring it up. But they don't, and the space grows. You pretend not to see it. You laugh at the same cues. You respond like you always do. But inside, you're running calculations, replaying old conversations, scanning for where it shifted. And even though you say nothing, your body knows. Your nervous system knows. You begin bracing every time their name appears on your screen. Eventually, the pattern becomes familiar. Someone pulls away, and you become quieter. Someone changes tone, and you downplay your reaction. You've learned how to read people's fading attention without ever asking why it's happening. Because asking makes you vulnerable. And being vulnerable to someone who's already pulling away feels worse than being left. Trigger 73. When you downplay your achievements because you've learned that success makes people act strange. You tell someone your news, a promotion, a goal reached, a personal milestone. You say it with joy, with hope, with the vulnerability that comes from wanting someone to celebrate with you. But their response is different than expected. Their smile doesn't quite reach their eyes. Their congratulations sound rehearsed. They change the subject too fast. And something in you closes. You didn't expect envy. You didn't expect discomfort. You just wanted to be seen. But instead of feeling proud, you feel guilty. Like you've said too much. Like your happiness has become a burden. Like you should have kept it quiet to make everyone else more comfortable. So the next time, you downplay it. You call it no big deal. You attribute it to luck. You tell people it wasn't that hard, even when it was. You make your success smaller, more digestible. You pretend you don't care about what you worked so hard for, because you've learned that minimizing yourself keeps the mood lighter. Eventually, you stop sharing wins altogether. You celebrate alone. You cross personal finish lines in silence. Not because you're humble, but because you're tired of feeling like joy is something that has to be filtered. And when someone says, "Why didn't you tell me?" you just shrug. Because by then, you've already learned that your success was never meant to be the center of anyone's joy but your own. Trigger 74. When you pretend you're okay with being the backup plan because saying otherwise feels desperate. You get the call after the original plan falls through. The text that starts with, "Hey, just wondering." The invite that feels like it wasn't meant for you until someone else said no. And you know it. You feel it. That sting of being second choice. The person they circle back to. The one they call when their first priority becomes unavailable. You laugh it off. You say yes. You pretend to be grateful just to be included. But inside, something twists. You replay the timeline. You wonder how many other times this has happened without you realizing. You wonder if you've always been a contingency in other people's lives. You want to say something. To ask, "Was I your first choice?" To admit that being the backup hurts. But you don't, because voicing that kind of hurt feels risky. It makes you seem needy, uncool, like you care too much. So instead, you wear the mask, the easygoing one, the happy to help, just glad to be here version of yourself. And the cycle repeats. Over time, you start adjusting to the role. You expect to be invited last. You assume you'll be forgotten until you're needed. You condition yourself to show up anyway, because part of you is still holding out hope that being available will eventually earn you permanence. But it never does. Eventually, you stop asking why you weren't thought of first. You stop hoping to be prioritized. Not because you're okay with being second, but because you've accepted that speaking up about it only makes people feel uncomfortable. And being left out hurts. But being seen as too much for wanting more, that hurts more. Trigger 75. When you start smiling out of habit because you don't know what your face is supposed to look like anymore. You catch yourself in the mirror, smiling. Not because you're happy. Not because anything's funny. Just because. Because somewhere along the way, you trained your face to look pleasant, approachable, calm. You don't remember when it started. Maybe during work calls, social events, or just walking down the street. But now, it's automatic. The smile comes without thought, without reason. At first, it seemed harmless, a social reflex, a way to smooth over tension. But then you start noticing how often it shows up in moments when you're actually feeling anything but okay. Someone says something sharp. You smile. A friend forgets to ask how you are. You smile. You hear something painful, and, again, the corners of your mouth lift, betraying the silence behind your eyes. You begin to resent it. This facial armor. This performance you didn't audition for. You wonder what your face would look like without it. If your expressions would still know how to match your inner world. But you don't get to find out, because the habit is too deep now. And people love it. They call you cheerful, easygoing, strong, as if those traits have ever meant peace. Over time, the smile stops being a reflex and becomes a costume. You wear it to protect others from discomfort, to signal that everything is manageable, to tell the world, "I won't make you feel awkward with my reality." And it works. No one asks questions. No one digs deeper. No one sees you. Eventually, you forget what your unsmiling self feels like. And the saddest part is, that version might have been the closest thing to honest you ever had. Trigger 76. When you learn to tell stories that make your pain sound entertaining, you start telling it like a joke. That breakup, that loss, that time everything fell apart. You give it rhythm. You hit the punchline. You let people laugh. You watch their faces relax with relief because your suffering came with an easy tone and a gentle smile. They're grateful, even if they don't say it. You made your trauma manageable. At first, it feels like power, like control. You get to tell the story your way. You turn sharp memories into smooth anecdotes. You remove the sting so no one flinches. You hide your own discomfort inside their laughter. And they thank you for it, without realizing they're being protected from the weight you still carry. You do it again and again. Your pain becomes a monologue, a rehearsed speech, a funny story. You catch yourself telling it with too much ease, too little truth. You skip the parts that still keep you up at night. You leave out the silence, the fear, the version of you that never fully recovered. Over time, you wonder if you've lost the right to feel it at all. If turning it into a performance has stripped it of meaning. People think you're fine because you made it sound fine. They never knew what was real, because you never gave them the chance. Eventually, you stop talking about it altogether. Not because you've healed, but because you can no longer tell the truth without first rewriting it into something they can laugh at. And you're tired of hearing them laugh. Trigger 77. When you no longer believe there's a safe place to say, "I'm not okay." You hear it all the time. "You can talk to me. I'm here if you ever need." Don't keep it bottled up. The invitation sounds sincere. You believe they mean it in theory. But in practice, you've learned otherwise. You've tried to open up before. You've tested the waters. And the water was cold. You remember the silence on the other end of the phone. The change in tone. The way the energy shifted when your truth didn't come wrapped in hope or humor. You remember being told to look on the bright side, or to stay strong, or that everything happens for a reason. None of it helped. And all of it taught you one thing. Not every space is safe for the truth. So now, when someone says, "How are you really?" you pause. You assess. You calibrate. You weigh the risk of honesty against the reward of being seen. And most of the time, you lie. Not a big lie. Just enough to keep the peace. Just enough to protect them from your heaviness. Because deep down, you don't believe most people can hold it. Not for long. Not without flinching. Not without making it about them. You've seen it too many times, the retreat, the awkwardness, the shift in eye contact. And so you become selective. Then quiet. Then mute. Eventually, you stop looking for a place to put your pain. You carry it like luggage you never get to set down. You become the friend who listens, the one who understands, the one who never asks for anything in return. And when someone says again, "You can always talk to me," all you can think is, you don't know what you're offering. Because if you did, you wouldn't offer it so lightly. Trigger 78. When you stop voicing your preferences because you've been told you're difficult for having them. It starts with something small. A restaurant you don't like. A movie you don't enjoy. A plan that doesn't suit you. You speak up. Not loudly. Just honestly. You say, "I'd rather not." You expect it to be heard. Instead, you get the look, the sigh, the passive-aggressive joke. "You're so picky. You're always difficult." And just like that, a simple preference becomes a character flaw. You try to clarify. You soften your words. But it doesn't matter. The tone has already shifted. Now you're not just a person with a boundary. You're a disruption. Someone who made things harder. Someone who asked for something others weren't willing to accommodate. So next time, you don't say anything. You go along with the plan. You agree to things you don't enjoy. You eat what's ordered. You sit through the movie. You laugh at the joke that isn't funny. And when people thank you for being chill, you nod and smile. But inside, a part of you folds in on itself. You stop checking in with your own preferences. You stop evaluating what you want. It becomes easier to silence your discomfort than to defend it. You tell yourself you're being easygoing, flexible, mature. But you're not. You're just erasing yourself in real time to avoid being labeled as too much. Eventually, you forget what your voice sounds like when it says no. Not because you don't have opinions, but because you've learned that having them costs more than they're worth. Trigger 79. When you begin saying, "It's just my anxiety," to dismiss feelings that are actually valid. You feel it in your chest. That tightening, that familiar swirl of thoughts, that sense that something is off. You try to describe it, but halfway through, you stop. You say, "It's probably just my anxiety." The words fall out like an apology, a disclaimer, a way to invalidate yourself before anyone else can. And people accept it. They nod. They let the moment move on. Because once you label your feelings as anxiety, no one has to address them. They don't have to engage with the content. They don't have to question whether you're sensing something real. They just hear the word and assume the problem is internal, something to be managed, soothed, ignored. So you start using it more. You preface conversations with it. "I know it's just my anxiety," but you cushion your concerns. You undermine your instincts. Even when the thing bothering you is real, you dilute it until it sounds like irrational fear. You detach from your own emotional truth just to avoid being seen as dramatic or unstable. Eventually, you start believing it. You feel uneasy. And instead of examining the situation, you blame your brain. You doubt your gut. You gaslight yourself before the world can. And while you may seem self-aware on the surface, you're quietly training yourself not to trust your own perception. Over time, the line between valid discomfort and anxious noise disappears. And the cost of peace becomes your ability to stand by your own truth, because you're too afraid that no one else will. Trigger 80. When you get used to being the one who cares more, and adjust yourself to match their detachment. At first, you care openly. You text first. You check in. You make plans. You remember details. You show up with presence, with consistency, with warmth. And for a while, it feels good, like maybe this is how connection is supposed to work. Until you realize it's not mutual. They don't match your energy. They respond, but slowly. They're interested, but only when convenient. They enjoy your attention but rarely offer their own. And still, you try. You hope. You rationalize. Maybe they're just busy. Maybe they're not good at expressing themselves. Maybe you're just too much. But then something shifts. You stop caring with the same intensity. Not because you feel any less, but because you're tired of feeling it alone. You text less. You stop checking in. You withhold the excitement in your voice. You delay your replies to mirror theirs. You calibrate every action to avoid seeming more invested. Over time, you become a version of yourself you don't recognize. Muted, measured, distant, not because it's who you are, but because it's who you had to become to feel less ridiculous in a relationship that only works when you stop showing how much you feel. Eventually, you convince yourself this is balance. But deep down, you know you didn't find balance. You just learned how to shrink yourself to match someone else's absence. Trigger 81. When you start saying, "I don't mind," before you even check what you actually feel. It becomes a reflex. Someone asks, "Where should we go? What do you want? Is this okay with you?" And before your brain even catches up, your mouth says it. "I don't mind." You say it automatically, with a smile, with ease, as if detachment is a personality trait, as if indifference makes you more likable. And maybe that's why it started, because somewhere along the way, you learned that having opinions came with friction, that your preferences could annoy people, slow things down, make you seem too particular. So you smoothed yourself out. You became agreeable, accommodating. You trained yourself to want what they wanted, to bend before being asked to. At first, it felt like flexibility, like maturity. But then you started noticing how empty your own wants became. You'd go places you didn't enjoy. You'd agree to things you later resented. You'd smile through discomfort and call it kindness. And every time you said, "I don't mind," a small part of you felt like a ghost in the room, present, but voiceless. Eventually, you forgot to check in with yourself at all. You stopped pausing before answering. Stopped listening for the yes or know that once lived in your gut. You replaced instinct with convenience, authenticity with ease, and people thanked you for it. They liked how low maintenance you were, how easygoing. But deep down, you knew what they liked wasn't really you. It was the version of you that never got in the way. And the price of peace was pretending you didn't care, even when you did. Trigger 82. When you assume the worst is coming just because things feel too quiet. There's a moment where everything feels still. No crises, no sharp texts, no silence that feels like punishment. And instead of relaxing into it, you tighten, because you know this feeling. Or rather, you know what usually comes after. The drop, the turn, the quiet before someone withdraws, or lashes out, or disappears. So you start scanning. You check your messages again. You replay the last conversation. You rehearse 100 possible things you might have done wrong. You start bracing for impact, even when no one said anything was wrong. Even when everything, on the surface, looks calm. You didn't choose this instinct. It was trained into you. You've lived through too many calm moments that ended in storms. You've seen how silence can morph into blame, how stillness often masks growing resentment. So now, peace feels like a warning sign. Quiet feels like tension waiting to snap. And instead of feeling relief, you feel dread. You don't talk about it, because it sounds irrational, paranoid, but your body doesn't lie. The shallow breath, the uneasy stomach, the loop of thoughts spinning fast enough to steal your focus. You tell yourself it's just overthinking, but it's not. It's pattern recognition, learned anxiety. Eventually, you stop trusting ease. You sabotage good days. You keep people at arm's length even when they're kind. Not because you want distance, but because expecting the worst has always made the blow easier. And now, even in the moments meant for rest, you never fully settle. Because some part of you is always on edge, waiting for the inevitable crack in the quiet. Trigger 83. When you start feeling guilty for taking up space, even in rooms you were invited into. You walk into the room, and immediately you shrink. Not physically, but emotionally. You take up less air. You choose the seat on the edge. You keep your thoughts soft, your laughter quieter, your needs tucked away. Even though you were invited, even though your name was on the list, part of you still feels like you're intruding. You weren't always this way. But after years of subtle exclusions, cold responses, and polite rejections, you started to believe that your presence was something to apologize for. You weren't always told you didn't belong, but you felt it. In the way conversations moved without you. In the way people forgot to loop you in. In the way your contributions were treated as extra, not essential. So you started editing yourself. You waited longer to speak. You second-guessed whether your comment would add anything. You filtered your presence until it was light enough not to disturb anyone. And people praised you for it. For being humble, easy to be around, so polite. But what they didn't see was the guilt, the constant second-guessing, the way you would rehearse sentences in your head just to avoid wasting anyone's time, the way you felt more like a guest than a participant in spaces that were meant to include you. Eventually, you stop showing up fully. You give just enough to stay in the room, but never enough to feel like you truly belong there. You let others speak. You let others lead. Not because you can't, but because some quiet voice still says, "Don't be too much." And the worst part, no one tells you to stop thinking that way. Because you've become so good at erasing yourself that they never even notice you're missing. Trigger 84. When you laugh even when you're hurt, just to keep the conversation comfortable for them. You feel the sting. Maybe it was a dismissive comment, a joke at your expense, a subtle insult wrapped in sarcasm. You feel your chest tighten, but before the discomfort can reach your face, you laugh. Not because it's funny, not because it's okay, but because the moment requires you to make it okay for them. You've done it so often that it's become automatic. You cover your wounds in humor. You disguise the sting with a smile. You keep the conversation smooth because the idea of making things awkward feels worse than being hurt. You've learned that your pain can be too much for people, but your laughter never is. And when you laugh, they relax. They don't notice the shift in your posture. They don't hear the hollow in your voice. They keep going, unaware that the joke landed like a knife, and you're the one who twisted it into something digestible. Eventually, the laughter becomes a reflex. You laugh to fill the silence, to avoid confrontation, to make someone else feel better about what they said, even when they don't deserve that comfort. You smile while bleeding. You crack jokes around your bruises. And the worst part is, no one suspects a thing, because you've trained yourself to be the emotional buffer between people and the consequences of their words. So they laugh, and you disappear behind the sound. Trigger 85. When you stop asking for clarification because you're tired of feeling dumb. You didn't use to hesitate. You used to ask the question. Raise your hand. Say, sorry, I don't understand. You used to believe that learning required curiosity, that asking wasn't a flaw. It was effort. But over time, that shifted. Maybe it was the sigh, the eye roll, the smirk from someone who made you feel like you should have already known. Maybe it was the way people explained things to others with more patience. Maybe it was the feeling that asking made the room tense, that your question disrupted the flow. So now, you nod even when you're lost. You pretend to follow along. You say, yeah, got it. When you don't, you write things down in secret, planning to look them up later, alone. You stop admitting when you're confused, not because you don't want clarity, but because you don't want to feel like a problem. Over time, you stop giving yourself permission to be a beginner. You silence your own curiosity. You'd rather fake comprehension than face condescension. You decide it's better to feel stupid privately than to risk being made to feel small in public. Eventually, you stop learning out loud. You listen in silence. You grow more hesitant, not because you care less, but because the cost of asking has become too high, and the fear of looking slow becomes louder than your need to understand. Trigger 86. When you become everyone's emotional dumping ground, but have nowhere to go with your own. They come to you first, always, with their crises, their heartbreaks, their confusion. You're the safe one, the strong one, the listener, the person who always answers, who always cares, who always seems to know what to say. And you don't mind at first. You're good at it. You want to help. You know what it feels like to need someone. But slowly, something shifts. You start noticing how one-sided it is. How you've become the container for everyone else's heaviness, but never the one being emptied out. You try to test it. You mention something small that's bothering you. You float a quiet, I'm not doing so great. And the response is quick. Deflection, minimization, a return to their story. You're there to absorb, not to express. So you stop trying. You keep showing up for others. You listen without interrupting. You hold space without boundaries. You let them cry, vent, spiral. But when the call ends, you're left alone with your own silent storm, and no one checks in after. You start carrying their pain alongside your own. You become weighed down, stretched thin, but you keep smiling. You keep being the strong friend, the empathetic one, the one who never needs anything back. Eventually, you realize that your support has become your prison, that your strength has made you invisible. And when you finally break, people say they're shocked, because you never said anything, because they never asked, because you were too busy holding everyone else together to fall apart in front of them. Trigger 87. When you start expecting rejection even before you finish your sentence. You open your mouth to speak and already, somewhere in your mind, you're preparing for dismissal. You rehearse your words mid-sentence. Soften them, dilute them. You make your voice smaller. You pre-apologize with your tone, not because you're unsure of what you're saying, but because you've lived through enough interactions to know how quickly people can shut you down. You've learned to watch for it. The twitch in someone's face, the glance away, the interruption before you reach the end. You remember how often you've been talked over, how many ideas were brushed aside, how many emotions were labeled as too much. too dramatic, too sensitive. So now, you preempt it. You shrink before they make you. You don't just expect to be unheard, you assume it. It becomes the lens through which every conversation passes. You're always halfway prepared to be ignored. You laugh off your own stories. You invalidate your point before they can. You start saying things like, maybe it's just me, or I don't know if this even makes sense, as if preparing them for the letdown of having to listen to you at all. Over time, your confidence erodes, not from lack of clarity, but from repeated exposure to the feeling that your voice takes up too much space. And slowly, speaking becomes exhausting, not because you don't have things to say, but because you're constantly bracing for silence in return. Eventually, the conversations you fear the most are the ones where you dare to speak honestly, because you've learned that the cost of vulnerability isn't always backlash. Sometimes it's just being completely ignored. Trigger 88. When you start offering to leave first just to avoid being left later. You sense it in the silence, in the slightly delayed reply, in the way plans suddenly take longer to confirm. You feel it before it's said out loud, someone pulling away, someone losing interest. And instead of waiting for the inevitable slow goodbye, you speed it up. You offer the out. I get it if you're busy. You don't have to explain. It's okay if you want space. You pretend it doesn't sting. It's not that you want to go. It's that you want to stay on your own terms. You want to leave before the rejection becomes undeniable. You want to protect what little dignity you have left by making the decision for them. So you do. You start packing your emotional bags while they're still pretending everything is fine. And when they accept your offer, when they don't fight to keep you, you tell yourself it was the right call, that it's better this way, that at least you had some control. But the truth is, you didn't want to go. You just wanted to know that someone would stop you, that someone would say, no, stay. But they never do. Over time, you get good at it, exiting early, closing the door before it slams. You build your identity around being the one who leaves, the strong one, the untouchable one. But inside, you carry the grief of every goodbye you initiated just to avoid the pain of being the one left behind. And the tragedy is, they were never the ones who let go first. You were. Trigger 89. When you downplay the depth of your relationships because you're afraid you felt more than they did. You remember the little things. The way they laughed. The way they reached for you. The late night talks. The quiet moments that felt bigger than anything you could explain. You replay these memories like scenes from a film that no one else seems to remember. And that's the problem. Because when it ended, when it faded, or drifted, or fell apart, they moved on faster than you expected. Or maybe they moved on exactly how you feared. And suddenly, the relationship that felt profound to you seemed casual to them. They described it with vague language. They skipped the details. They left you out of the narrative entirely. So you stopped speaking of it. Or if you did, you made it sound smaller. You called it a phase. You laughed when someone brought them up. You told yourself maybe you misread it all. Maybe you were the one who felt too deeply. Maybe it was never mutual. You rewrite the story in a way that's easier to carry. You strip out the significance. You erase the parts that made it real to you. Not because it wasn't real, but because admitting it was, while watching the other person treat it like a footnote, is a kind of heartbreak you don't know how to explain. So you say things like, it wasn't that serious, or it just didn't work out, while swallowing the truth that you're still holding memories they've already let go of. And maybe the worst part isn't the ending. It's being the only one who remembers it like it meant something. Trigger 90. When you pretend you didn't notice the disrespect because standing up for yourself feels like too much work. They say it casually. A comment that cuts a little deeper than it should. Maybe it's a joke about your appearance. A backhanded compliment. A dismissive tone that feels too familiar. You notice it instantly. And for a moment, you think about calling it out. But you don't. You nod. You half smile. You let it pass like it didn't happen. Because challenging it would take more from you than you're willing to spend. You've done this before. You've stood your ground, and you remember what happened. The denial, the defensiveness, the way the conversation suddenly became about your reaction instead of their behavior. You remember how it felt to be told you're too sensitive, too serious, too much. And eventually, you started weighing every response against the energy it would cost you. So now, you let things slide, not because they're harmless, but because you're tired of always being the one who has to explain why it wasn't okay. You're tired of being the mirror that makes people uncomfortable with their own reflection. So you say nothing. You laugh when it's easier. You tell yourself it's not worth it. But it is, because every time you let something slide, you carry it with you. It doesn't leave. It settles into your shoulders, into your breath, into your silence. And the person who disrespected you moves on, unaware, while you spend the rest of the day replaying what you should have said. Eventually, it becomes a pattern, a quiet ritual of self-betrayal disguised as composure. You're not keeping the peace. You're just keeping yourself quiet enough not to be a problem. And over time, you begin to wonder if people truly respect you, or if they've just learned you won't speak up when they don't. Trigger 91. When you become afraid of being a burden, even to the people who say they care. You feel it rising, the urge to reach out, to say, I'm not okay, to ask, can we talk? But before your fingers can move, the hesitation sets in. You imagine their face when they see your name pop up again. You picture the sigh, the pause, the silent calculation of whether they have the energy to deal with you today. So you don't send the message. You tell yourself they're busy, that it's not that important, that you'll feel better in a few hours. You wait. You distract yourself. You try to carry it alone, not because you want to, but because some part of you has been convinced that needing others is a kind of emotional tax, that every cry for help comes with a receipt. This fear didn't come from nowhere. Maybe it started with someone who used your vulnerability against you. Maybe it was the friend who disappeared when things got heavy. Maybe it was the silence after you finally opened up. Whatever it was, it taught you that love has limits, and yours might already be at the edge. So you play it safe. You're the one who listens, who comforts, who stays strong. You don't show the cracks unless they're small enough to laugh about. And even then, you minimize. I'm just being dramatic. It's nothing serious. You hand them your pain like it's a favor they can decline. Eventually, even when someone asks how you're doing, your instinct is to lie. Not because you don't want connection, but because the fear of being a burden now outweighs the desire to be known. And the saddest part is, you're not even sure who taught you to be this quiet about what hurts. Trigger 92. When you stop dreaming about the future because it's safer not to expect anything. You used to imagine it, a version of your life that felt bigger, fuller. You'd think about places you wanted to go, the people you might love, the person you were still becoming. There was hope in it, excitement, a quiet belief that better things were waiting somewhere up ahead. But slowly, that vision faded, not all at once. It disappeared in pieces, with every plan that fell through, every door that closed, every time the thing you hoped for didn't happen. Or worse, almost happened and then slipped away. You told yourself it was fine, that you were being realistic, that you were maturing. But deep down, you knew something was being buried, not killed, just hidden. You stopped talking about your future out loud, stopped making lists, stopped circling dates on the calendar. You told yourself you were being present, but what you really meant was, I'm tired of being let down. You started focusing on today not because today was enough, but because tomorrow had let you down too many times. Eventually, you stopped dreaming altogether, not because you didn't want more, but because it became too painful to imagine a version of your life that might never come. You learned to live inside the now, not as a practice in mindfulness, but as a strategy for disappointment management. And when someone asks you what you see for yourself 5 years from now, all you can think is survival. I just want to make it through without getting my hopes up again. Trigger 93. when you stop believing in coincidences because everything starts to feel like confirmation. It happens too often to ignore. A person drifts away just when you start to trust them. A good moment ends faster than it began. You give something your full heart, and it quietly falls apart. You begin to notice the patterns, the timing, the repetition, and after a while, it no longer feels like bad luck. It feels personal, predictable, confirming something you didn't want to believe about yourself. You stop calling it coincidence. You stop telling yourself, it just didn't work out. You start assigning meaning to the silence, the sudden distance, the unexplained change. You begin assuming that the universe is simply mirroring back what you secretly believe, that everything slips away eventually. So you withdraw a little earlier. You speak with more caution. You smile with less weight. You stop letting good moments stretch out too far because they've never lasted before. And you've learned not to trust anything that feels too stable. And when people say, "Don't overthink it," you nod, but deep down, you've already decided, nothing is random. Even kindness begins to feel suspicious. You wait for the turn. You scan for the angle. You assume disappointment is always just one step behind you, ready to tap your shoulder the moment you relax. Eventually, you stop hoping for better. Not because you don't want better, but because when enough things fall apart at the same rhythm, the silence that follows starts sounding like the universe saying, "You were right not to believe in this." Trigger 94. When you start interpreting love as temporary, no matter how steady it feels, you're in a moment that feels warm, safe. Someone is showing up, calling back, listening. They care, and they're not hiding it. But even as the good unfolds, a part of you stays braced. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because you've learned that consistency can break without warning. You've lived through too many beginnings that didn't last. So you study the details, how long it takes for them to reply, whether their tone shifts midweek, whether their face drops when they think you're not watching. You don't do it on purpose, it's instinct now. A quiet hypervigilance that scans for cracks before they become full exits. And when they say, "I'm not going anywhere," you smile, but you don't believe them. Not fully, not out of spite, not out of bitterness, but because the voice in your head whispers, "They all said that." You start holding your affection tighter. You give less, just in case. You prepare yourself quietly, building emotional escape routes in your mind, thinking, if they leave, at least I won't be caught off guard. You think you're being cautious, but really, you're grieving a loss that hasn't even happened yet. Eventually, even when someone stays, you don't feel relief, because by then, you've already rehearsed their absence too many times to enjoy their presence. Trigger 95. When you stop trusting your own excitement because it always seems to lead to disappointment. You get the message, the opportunity, the invitation, and for a flicker of a second, you feel it hope. You feel your stomach lift, your mind race, your body lean toward the future like something good might actually be coming. But just as quickly, something inside you pulls it back. You freeze the feeling. You don't want to fall for it again, because you've learned that excitement doesn't lead to joy. It leads to a letdown. It leads to cancellations, to changes of heart, to things that almost happen but don't. You've opened yourself to the moment before, only to have it close in on you. So now, you preempt your own excitement. You say things like, "We'll see. I'm not getting my hopes up," trying not to think about it too much. It's not pessimism, it's survival. Because every time you've let yourself fully feel joy ahead of time, something outside your control took it away. And the grief of that kind of whiplash, the going from hope to hollow, is something you don't want to feel again. So now you keep things flat. You deaden the spark. You don't share the news until it's confirmed. You don't tell your friends. You wait for the twist, the drop, the silence. And when it doesn't come, you feel relief, not joy. Because you weren't aiming for joy anymore. You were just trying not to be disappointed again. Eventually, even when something good does happen, it doesn't feel the way it used to. because the part of you that used to celebrate never came to the party. Trigger 96. When you begin to feel more comfortable being misunderstood than risking vulnerability again. You speak carefully. You use words that are easy to digest. You round off the edges of your truth. And when someone misinterprets your meaning, you let it slide. You smile and nod. You don't correct them. Not because they're right, but because you've learned what happens when you try to explain yourself. You've tried it before. You opened up. You said the honest thing. You peeled back a layer and offered someone the version of you that doesn't come with a filter. And they didn't get it. Or worse, they twisted it. They made it about them. They called you dramatic, or cold, or confusing, and you were left standing there, more exposed than ever, with nothing but the echo of your own voice for comfort. So now, when someone assumes the wrong thing about you, you let them. When they say, "You seem fine," you say, "Yeah, I'm fine." When they say, "You're so chill," you nod, even though you're carrying a storm behind your teeth. You tell yourself it's easier this way, safer, cleaner. At least being misunderstood doesn't require you to bleed in public. And it works. Sort of. People feel close to you without actually knowing you. They like your quiet, your calm, your lightness. They never see the weight you've buried underneath the parts of you they find comfortable. And over time, even you forget what it was like to be truly seen, because you stopped giving people the chance. Eventually, you stop expecting to be understood, and you begin confusing safety with silence. Trigger 97. When you stop feeling jealous and start feeling invisible. You used to feel it. That sharp little burn when someone got chosen instead of you. When they were invited, noticed, prioritized. You used to feel that mix of envy and sadness, the question spinning in your mind. Why not me? But now, you don't even feel that anymore. You've gone past jealousy. You've reached something quieter, numb, detached. It's not that you don't care. It's that you've stopped expecting to be considered at all. The group messages move on without you. The milestones happen, and you hear about them secondhand. You watch people you care about grow closer to others, and it doesn't sting like it used to. It just confirms what you already assumed. You're easy to forget. You stop trying to insert yourself. You stop reminding people of your presence. You stop dropping hints that you'd like to be included, not out of bitterness, but because you're tired of chasing something that never reaches back. You'd rather accept invisibility than keep begging to be seen. So you start shrinking. You don't share updates. You become the listener, never the speaker. You support from a distance but never expect reciprocity. People call you low maintenance, independent, so easy to be around. But they don't realize that it's not strength, it's retreat. Eventually, the absence of jealousy isn't peace. It's proof that you've accepted the role of background character in lives you once wanted to be centered in. Trigger 98. When you feel safer in imaginary conversations than real ones because you can control the outcome. You rehearse it in your head, what you'd say, how they might respond, the pauses, the tone, the resolution. You play it over and over, adjusting every word until it feels just right. The version of the conversation where you're understood, where your voice lands without interruption, where no one gets defensive or walks away. And then you realize you're not actually planning to say any of it. You're not preparing for a real dialogue. You're building a private version of it where nothing goes wrong, because real conversations never feel this safe. You've tried before. You've spoken up. You've shared your side. And what you got in return was confusion, anger, silence, or shame. So now, instead of risking that again, you keep it internal. You replay the same emotional loop in your mind, not to solve it, but to protect yourself from the fallout of being misunderstood or dismissed again. In your mind, the words flow. The outcome is fair. Your emotions are met with care. You get the closure you never received. But outside, everything remains the same. Nothing gets said. Nothing gets addressed. The distance between you and the person grows. But at least you didn't lose control of how it played out. Eventually, these inner conversations become more satisfying than the real ones ever were. Because in your head, you don't have to explain your worth. You don't have to defend your needs. You don't have to hope someone will meet you halfway. You already do that for yourself, in silence. Trigger 99. When you begin to feel relief instead of joy when someone finally understands you, because it took too long. They get it. Finally. Maybe it's a sentence they echo back, a feeling they validate, a truth you shared long ago that suddenly lands with them now. And in that moment, you should feel something, joy, comfort, maybe even gratitude. But instead, you feel numb, tired, quietly resentful, even because by the time they understood, something inside you had already given up waiting. You remember the early days when you tried to explain it, when you reached for the words, when you gave examples, hinted, clarified, all the emotional labor you carried just trying to be seen clearly. And for so long, they didn't get it, or they wouldn't, or they said they did, but their actions showed otherwise. So you stopped pushing. You adjusted your expectations. You made peace with being partially known, half met, superficially understood. And now, in this late moment of recognition, you can't bring yourself to celebrate it. It feels overdue, too late to feel whole, too late to rewrite the loneliness you had to swallow while they caught up to your reality. You nod. You thank them. You say, yeah, exactly. But it doesn't feel like connection. It feels like closure that never quite closes anything, because the version of you that needed this acknowledgement is already gone. And what's left is someone who has grown used to being misunderstood. Eventually, you stop hoping for understanding at all, not because you've stopped needing it, but because you've learned how to live without it. Trigger 100, when you realize you've mastered emotional survival, but you don't remember what it's like to simply feel safe. You handle things. You respond calmly. You stay composed. You're the person others lean on. You don't cry unless no one's around. You don't panic out loud. You always know what to do. And people admire that. They call you strong, resilient, grounded, but they don't see the wiring underneath. The way your mind is always scanning for danger. The way you can't relax, even when nothing's wrong. The way your nervous system treats silence as threat, comfort as temporary, and happiness as something to be monitored, not felt. You've mastered emotional survival. You can regulate, deflect, endure. But in the quiet moments, when there's no crisis to manage, you realize something's missing. You don't know how to rest. Not really. Not without guilt. Not without tension. Not without waiting for the moment when everything might fall apart again. You're not unsafe, but you never quite feel safe either. Because safety, for you, was never a given. It was something you earned through control, through perfection, through scanning and adapting. And now, even in good moments, you're still on guard, still anticipating the turn. Eventually, you start wondering if you'll ever feel calm without effort, if you'll ever experience peace without having to earn it. You're not just surviving anymore. You're surviving the absence of danger as if it were danger itself. And the tragedy is, you've become so good at managing pain that joy no longer knows where to land.